Hello and welcome for today's cryptid horror stories. In the comments, where are you from and what kind of cryptids do you like? Now for the stories. The Blood Harvest. The newsreel flickered to life with a sound like dry leaves scraping concrete, the black and white images jumping and stuttering as the ancient projector struggled to maintain its grip on the past. Bill Robinson sat in the basement of the Brunswick County Historical Society, his eyes fixed on the screen, his hands gripping the wooden armrests of his chair with white-knuckled intensity. He had found the film by accident, buried in a box marked MISC, 1950s, that had been donated by the estate of a deceased newspaperman. He had nearly thrown it away, thinking it was damaged beyond recovery, but something, a prickling on the back of his neck, a sense of connection he couldn't explain, had made him take it to the film restoration lab in Wilmington. Now, watching the footage for the first time, he understood why. The date stamp in the corner read November 14, 1954. The location was Bladenboro, North Carolina. The footage showed Main Street in the small town, but not the Main Street Bill knew from his childhood visits to his grandmother. This was a different Bladenboro, a town gripped by panic. People crowded the sidewalks, clutching rifles and shotguns, their faces pale and frightened. Children were being herded into buildings, doors locked, windows barred. Men in hunting gear gathered in groups, talking urgently, gesturing toward the woods that encroached on the town's edges. The camera moved closer to a reporter, a young man in a suit that was already going out of style, holding a microphone with a network logo that no longer existed. "This is Thomas Grady reporting from Bladenboro, North Carolina," the reporter said, his voice crackling with static and age. "For 3 nights, something has been stalking the woods around this town, something that has killed livestock, pets, and now the search has turned to finding whatever is responsible." The camera panned to show a line of hunters forming up at the edge of town, their trucks loaded with dogs and equipment. Authorities are calling this a coordinated search for a rabid animal, possibly a bear or large cat that has wandered from the mountains. But locals are telling a different story. The footage cut to an interview with an elderly man, his face deeply lined, his eyes haunted by something that had happened decades ago but still lived in his memory. "It ain't no bear," the man said, his voice barely audible through the static. "It ain't no cat, it's something else, something that shouldn't be. My cousin saw it plain as day, standing on 2 legs like a man but with claws like a panther. Took his dog right out of the yard, took it and ate it, while it was still screaming." Bill felt his stomach clench. The date, 1954, the same year his grandfather had died. The same year his grandmother had moved away from Bladenboro and never spoken of it again. The same year that had been erased from family history, wrapped in silence and buried with the dead. The footage continued, showing search parties returning empty-handed, their faces grim, their dogs whining and refusing to enter the woods. It showed tracks in the mud, strange tracks like a large cat but wrong, the gait too long, the toes too numerous. It showed claw marks on trees, on fences, on the side of a barn where something had tried to get at the animals inside. And then finally, it showed the thing itself. The camera was handheld, shaky, the operator running as he filmed. Through the trees, glimpsed in flashes between trunks and branches, was a shape. Low to the ground, moving fast, fur dark against the gray forest. It was quadrupedal, but something about its movement was wrong. Its gait unbalanced, its limbs bending in ways that made Bill's eyes water to watch. The camera operator stumbled, the image tilting wildly, and when it stabilized, the thing was closer. Close enough to see details, close enough to see the face. It wasn't a cat. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything Bill had ever seen in a zoo or a nature documentary. It was something else. Something with a face that was almost human, almost recognizable but stretched and distorted, the mouth too wide, the eyes too large, the teeth, the teeth, too numerous and too sharp. The thing looked at the camera, looked through the camera, through time itself, and Bill felt like it was looking at him. Like it knew he was watching, 70 years later, and was remembering. The footage cut to static. When it cleared, it was a different scene. A group of men in military uniforms standing around a body covered by a tarp. No faces visible, no identification possible. But the shape under the tarp was wrong. Too long, too thin. The proportions were not human. "The search continues," the reporter's voice said, though he was no longer on screen. "But many here are saying that whatever is in these woods, it is not of this world, and they fear that killing it may be impossible." The newsreel ended with a shot of the sun setting behind the trees, the shadows lengthening, and a final image. Just a glimpse, barely there, of something watching from the darkness. Bill sat in the silence of the basement, his heart hammering, his hands shaking. He had come here looking for information about his grandfather's death, about the mysterious circumstances that had driven his grandmother from her hometown and into a life of silence. He had expected to find records, newspaper articles, perhaps a mention in the local historical society's files. He had not expected to find proof. The film canister had contained more than just the newsreel. There were documents, photographs, handwritten notes that had been hidden for decades, a file labeled Project Black Cat in faded military lettering, classified stamps, warnings about unauthorized disclosure, and a photograph. The photograph. It showed a creature in a cage, or what had once been a cage. The bars were bent, broken, the metal twisted like paper. The creature was dead, or appeared to be dead, lying on its side with its eyes open and staring. But the body. Bill had seen corpses before. His uncle had been a mortician, and Bill had spent summers in the funeral home, learning the trade, learning to see death as a puzzle to be solved rather than a mystery to be feared. He knew human anatomy. He knew animal anatomy. He knew what bodies looked like. This was neither human nor animal. It was something in between, something that had started as one and become the other. The face was feline, but the skull structure was wrong, too large, too elongated. The body was muscular, powerful, but the proportions were off. The hind legs too long, the forelegs too short, the spine curved in an S shape that suggested permanent damage or deliberate modification. And there were the hands, the front paws, the things that had been both. They were hands almost, 5 fingers with opposable thumbs, but the fingers ended in retractable claws like a cat's. The palms were covered in pads, but the skin was hairless, pink, almost human. The creature was a hybrid, a chimera, something that had been made, not born. The file was sparse, heavily redacted, but Bill could piece together the story. 1953, a military research facility in Bladen County, experiments involving transfusion technology and jaguar DNA, attempts to create enhanced soldiers or biological weapons. Something had gone wrong. Something had escaped. The 1954 attacks had been covered up. The creature had been hunted down and killed. The project had been terminated, the records sealed, the witnesses silenced. But the newsreel suggested that whatever they had killed was not the only one, that there had been others, that there might still be others. Bill gathered the materials, placed them carefully in his bag, and walked out of the Historical Society into the afternoon light. He drove home to Bolivia, North Carolina, 30 miles from Bladenboro, his mind racing with possibilities. He should have called someone, the police, the FBI, a journalist, anyone who could verify what he had found, who could investigate, who could protect the public if there was still a threat. But he didn't, because as he pulled into his driveway, he saw the first sign that the threat was not historical, that it was immediate, that it was here. Brutus was dead. Brutus was Bill's pit bull, a 90-pound brindle who had been with him for 8 years, since he was a puppy. A gentle giant who wouldn't hurt a fly but would defend his territory with his life. He had been torn apart. The fence around Bill's yard was 8 feet high, reinforced with chain link. Brutus had never tried to escape, had never shown any interest in the world beyond his territory. But something had gotten in. Something had gotten past the fence, past the locked gate, past the motion-activated lights and the security cameras. Brutus lay in the center of the yard, his body positioned with deliberate care. His ribs were splayed open, the bones cracked and spread like a broken umbrella. The organs were missing. The heart, liver, kidneys, all gone. But the worst was the face. His jaws had been forced open beyond their natural range until the bone had cracked. His teeth were missing, pulled out, collected, and in their place something had been inserted. Teeth that were too long, too sharp, teeth that belonged to a predator. Bill fell to his knees in the grass, his hands shaking as he reached for his dog, his friend, his companion of 8 years. Brutus was still warm, his blood still wet. Whatever had done this had been here recently, had been watching, had waited for Bill to leave before it struck. He looked around, scanning the yard, the fence, the tree line. Nothing moved, nothing made a sound. The world was silent, holding its breath, and then he saw it. A mark on the fence, claw marks deep in the metal that had stripped away the paint and scored the steel beneath. The marks were too large for any dog, too curved for any bear. They were the marks of something else, something that could climb an 8-foot fence with ease, something that could tear through chain link like paper. Bill called the police. He reported a coyote attack, a large predator, something that had killed his dog. They sent an officer who looked at the body, at the fence, at the claw marks, and shook his head. "This wasn't a coyote," the officer said. "Coyotes don't do this. They don't arrange the bodies. They don't pull teeth. This was something else." "What then?" Bill asked. The officer didn't answer. He wrote up a report, took some photographs, and told Bill to stay inside after dark. "Lock your doors," he said. "Keep your windows shut. And if you see anything at all, call 911. Don't try to handle it yourself." Bill buried Brutus that evening in a corner of the yard under the oak tree where the dog had liked to sleep. He dug the grave himself, not trusting anyone else with the task, and he buried the strange teeth with the body. He didn't know what else to do with them. He didn't want them in his house. He slept poorly that night, waking every hour to check the locks, to listen for sounds outside. He kept the lights on, every light in the house burning, creating a fortress of illumination against the darkness. The next morning, Brutus was back. Bill stepped outside to get the newspaper and found the body lying on his welcome mat, posed like a grotesque welcome statue. The grave was empty, the dirt scattered, the hole yawning open like a mouth. The body was worse than before. The decomposition had accelerated overnight, the flesh turning black and slimy, the eyes missing, the tongue swollen and purple. But the position was deliberate. The front legs were extended, the head raised as if Brutus were greeting visitors, as if he were inviting them in. And on the mat beneath him, written in something that looked like blood but smelled like copper and rot, were 2 words, "I remember." Bill didn't call the police this time. He knew they couldn't help. He knew that whatever was happening was beyond their understanding, beyond their ability to stop. He called his uncle, the mortician, the man who had taught him about death. "Uncle Ray," he said when the old man answered, "I need to tell you something about Grandpa, about what really happened in 1954. There was a long silence on the line. Then, "Meet me at the funeral home. 1 hour. Don't tell anyone where you're going." The funeral home had been in the family for 3 generations. Ray Robinson had run it for 40 years, and before him, his father, and before him, his father's father. They were the keepers of death in Brunswick County, the ones who prepared the bodies, who comforted the grieving, who knew the secrets that families kept. Ray was waiting in the preparation room, the stainless steel tables gleaming under fluorescent lights, the smell of formaldehyde and disinfectant thick in the air. He was 70 years old, his hair white, his hands scarred from decades of working with blades and needles and chemicals. But his eyes were sharp, alert, and filled with a fear that Bill had never seen before. "You found the film," Ray said. "It wasn't a question. How did you know?" "Because it always starts with the film, or the file, or the photograph. something that connects the present to 1954, something that wakes it up. Wakes what up? Ray walked to a filing cabinet in the corner, one that Bill had never been allowed to open as a child. He withdrew a key from around his neck, a key that Bill had never seen him wear, and unlocked the cabinet. Inside were files, dozens of files, all marked with dates, names, locations, all from Brunswick County, all from the same pattern. "Your grandfather didn't die in a car accident," Ray said, his voice barely audible. "He died in 1954, yes, but not in a car. He died hunting it, hunting the thing that Project Black Cat created." He pulled out a file, handed it to Bill. He was part of the team, the military team that tried to contain the experiment when it went wrong. He saw what they made, he saw what it could do, and he helped kill it. Bill opened the file. Inside were photographs, autopsy photos, crime scene photos of bodies that had been torn apart, eviscerated, consumed. Not just animals, people. Men and women who had been part of the project, who had tried to stop the escape, who had died screaming. "They thought they killed it," Ray continued. "In 1954, after the attacks in Bladenboro, they tracked it down and killed it. But they were wrong. They killed one. There were others. There had always been others. And the project didn't end in 1954. It went underground. It kept going." He pulled out another file, newer, dated 1989. "Phase 2, he read. "It learned to hibernate, to sleep for years, even decades, to wait, to be patient. And when it woke, it was stronger, smarter, different." "Different how?" Ray looked at his nephew with eyes that had seen too much. "It learned to breed." The third night, the howling started. It came from the woods behind Bill's house, a sound that was part animal, part something else. A howl that rose and fell in patterns that suggested language, communication, intelligence. Bill listened from his bedroom window, his shotgun across his knees, his heart hammering. At midnight he heard something else, the sound of breaking glass, coming from his neighbor's house. Leon Williams, 3 doors down, a good man, a family man, a man with 2 pit bulls who never left his side. Bill grabbed his shotgun and ran. He found Leon in the driveway, crawling toward his truck, his legs trailing behind him, useless, shredded. The man was screaming, high-pitched and continuous, a sound of agony that Bill had never heard from a human throat. "Help me," Leon screamed. "Oh God, help me, it took them, it took both of them." Bill looked at the house. The picture window was shattered, the glass scattered across the lawn like diamonds. Through the hole he could see into the living room, see the blood, see the destruction. And see the thing that was still inside. It was massive, larger than any natural cat, larger than a tiger or lion. But it wasn't just size that made it wrong. It was the shape, the proportions, the way it moved. It was on all fours, crouched over something in the center of the room, its body blocking Bill's view of whatever it was eating. But Bill could hear the sounds. The wet tearing, the crunch of bone, the satisfied grunts of feeding. And he could see the tail that was wrong. It was thick as a man's arm, and it moved with a sinuous grace that suggested muscles and bones in configurations that shouldn't exist. At the end, barely visible in the darkness, was something that looked almost like a hand. Fingers, claws, a grasping appendage that had no business being on a cat's tail. "Shoot it," Leon screamed. "For God's sake, shoot it." Bill raised the shotgun. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold it steady. He aimed at the thing's back at the center of mass and fired. The sound was deafening. The recoil knocked him back a step. And the thing turned. It moved faster than thought, faster than sight, spinning with a fluid grace that defied its size. The shotgun pellets had hit home. Bill could see the wounds, the blood, the fur torn away to reveal pink flesh beneath. But the thing didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. It looked at him, looked through him, and it smiled. The face was the worst part. Not because it was alien, but because it was almost human. The structure was there. the cheekbones, the jawline, the placement of the eyes. But the proportions were wrong, stretched, distorted. The mouth was too wide, extending almost to the ears, filled with teeth that were too numerous and too sharp. The eyes were human-shaped, but the pupils were wrong, slitted like a cat's, glowing with a faint luminescence that shouldn't have been possible. And the nose. The nose was almost gone, just slits above the mouth, the cartilage retracted to make room for more teeth. "Run," the thing said. It spoke. With a voice that was almost human, almost recognizable, it spoke. The word was clear, distinct, formed by lips and tongue and teeth that had never been meant for language. "Run, little man. Run and tell the others. Tell them I'm awake. Tell them I'm hungry. Tell them. The harvest has begun." Bill ran. He grabbed Leon's arm and dragged him to the truck, threw him in the back seat and floored the accelerator. Behind them, the thing watched from the broken window, its tail lashing, its tongue long, forked, tasting the air, flicking in and out. They drove to the hospital, Bill screaming at the nurses, the doctors, anyone who would listen. Leon was dying, bleeding out from wounds that didn't make sense, from trauma that shouldn't have been survivable. His legs were gone below the knee, chewed off, the stumps cauterized somehow, burned black by something that wasn't fire. The doctors worked on him for 6 hours. They gave him 12 units of blood, more than the human body should have been able to take. They stitched and stapled and prayed. But Leon died at 4:47 a.m., his last words whispered to Bill through lips that barely moved. "It has them," Leon said. "My dogs, it's changing them, making them like it. Don't let them out, don't let them. Don't let them breed." He died then, his heart stopping, his body finally giving up the fight. But Bill knew with a certainty that made him want to scream, that the death wasn't the end, that something would happen to Leon's body, that he would be collected, used, made into something else. The security footage from Leon's house told the rest of the story. Bill convinced the police to let him see it, using his uncle's connections, using the weight of the Robinson family name. They watched in horror as the thing emerged from the woods, moving with a speed that shouldn't have been possible, climbing the side of the house like a spider, entering through the second-story window. They saw it kill Leon's dogs. Not quickly, not cleanly, slowly, methodically, starting with the smaller one, a female named Daisy, pinning her down and doing something, inserting something, injecting something. Daisy had convulsed, her body arching, her legs kicking. And then she had changed. Her spine had elongated, her jaw had extended, her teeth had grown, right there on the screen while she was still alive. The transformation took less than a minute. One moment she was a pit bull, terrified and dying. The next she was something else. Something that stood up on legs that bent wrong and looked at the camera with eyes that glowed yellow. Then the thing, the original, the parent, had turned its attention to the second dog, a male named Tank, and it had started the process again. But Tank had fought, had broken free, had crashed through the picture window and into the night, dragging his transforming body behind him, his hindquarters already changing, already becoming something else. The thing had followed, had hunted Tank down in the driveway, had caught him as he tried to reach the truck. And then it had turned its attention to Leon. The video ended there. The camera had shorted out, fried by something. Electrical discharge, electromagnetic pulse. Bill didn't know, but he had seen enough. "We need to call the military," he told the police captain. "We need to call the FBI. We need to tell them that Project Black Cat is back, that the experiments are loose." The captain looked at him with eyes that were too knowing. "Project Black Cat was terminated in 1954, he said. "There are no more experiments, no more creatures. What you saw was a rabid animal, a bear maybe, or a large cat that escaped from a private collection." "You saw the video," Bill said. "You saw what it did, what it is." "I saw a bear," the captain said, his voice hard. "And you will see a bear too, because the alternative is something that this town, this state, this country cannot handle. Do you understand me, Mr. Robinson? Some things are better left buried. Some truths are better left unknown." He handed Bill a card, a phone number. If you see anything else, call this number. Don't call 911. Don't call the police. Call this number." "Whose number is it?" The captain didn't answer. He just looked at Bill with eyes that held no hope and said, "Run, Mr. Robinson, while you still can." Bill didn't run. He went home to his house with its empty yard and its oak tree and its grave that wouldn't stay filled. He sat on his porch with his shotgun and he waited. The howling continued that night and the next and the next. Always from the woods, always at midnight, always followed by silence. The silence of predators waiting. The silence of the hunted holding their breath. On the fifth night, something answered the howling. It came from the direction of Bolivia, from the farms and fields that stretched between the town and the forest. A scream that wasn't human, wasn't animal, but something between. A scream that went on, rising and falling, accompanied by sounds of destruction, of crashing, of tearing metal and splintering wood. Bill got in his truck and drove toward the sound. He didn't know why. Maybe to help, maybe to witness, maybe just to know. He found the farm at dawn, or what was left of it. The farmhouse was still standing, but barely. The windows were shattered, the doors torn from their hinges, the walls gouged with claw marks that were too large, too deep, too numerous. The family, a mother, father, 3 children, had locked themselves in the basement. They were alive but catatonic, their eyes vacant, their minds broken by whatever they had heard in the night. The barn was worse. Bill had seen death before. He had worked in his uncle's funeral home, had prepared bodies, had seen the aftermath of car accidents and house fires and the occasional violent crime. He had thought he was inured to horror. He was wrong. The barn had contained 60 goats. The goats were gone. In their place, hanging from the rafters by their own intestines, were things. They looked like goats, at first, but as Bill approached, his flashlight beam trembling, he saw the differences. The elongated spines, the extra limbs, the faces that were wrong, stretched, transformed into something that was trying to be something else. And the wounds, the bites, the marks of something that had fed on them while they changed, that had used their bodies as incubators, as food sources, as raw material for whatever was being created here. On the barn door, scratched deep into the wood with claws that had to be sharpened, were 3 words: "I remember." The same words that had been on his welcome mat. The same words that connected him, that marked him, that told him this was personal. This was revenge. This was payment for debts that had been incurred 70 years ago. Bill understood then. The creature, the thing that Project Black Cat had created, remembered his grandfather, remembered the man who had helped hunt it, who had helped kill its brothers and sisters, who had tried to end the experiment. And now it was collecting from the bloodline, taking payment in flesh and fear. He called the number the captain had given him. A man answered on the second ring. "State the nature of your emergency." "My name is Bill Robinson," Bill said, his voice shaking. "My grandfather was Dr. James Robinson. He was part of Project Black Cat in 1954. The thing you made, the thing you let escape. It's back, and it's killing, and it's changing things. Making more of itself." There was a long silence. Then, "Stay where you are, Mr. Robinson. A team will be there in 2 hours. Do not attempt to leave. Do not attempt to contact anyone else. And do not, under any circumstances, go into the woods." The line went dead. Bill waited. He sat in his truck, the doors locked, the engine running, and he watched the tree line. The sun rose higher, burning off the mist, revealing a world that looked normal, peaceful, unchanged. But he knew better. He knew that under the surface, in the shadows, in the places where humans didn't look, something was hunting, something was feeding, something was remembering. The team arrived at 8:30 a.m. 3 black SUVs, no markings, no license plates. 6 men in black tactical gear, faces hidden behind helmets and goggles. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't ask questions. They just looked at the barn, at the hanging corpses, at the words scratched in the door, and nodded. "Confirmed," one of them said into a radio. "Phase 3 initiated." They moved through the property like professionals, collecting samples, taking photographs, gathering evidence. They didn't touch the bodies in the barn. Biological hazard, the leader said when Bill asked. Contamination protocols. What happens now? Bill asked. You go home, the leader said. You lock your doors, you stay inside after dark, and you forget what you saw. I can't forget, Bill said. My dog is dead, my neighbor is dead, that thing. It spoke to me. It knows my name, it knows my blood, I can't just forget. The leader turned to look at him and Bill saw something in his eyes, pity maybe, or fear. Then you have two choices, the man said. You can be a victim, or you can be bait. Bait for what? For the thing that's hunting you, the thing that remembers. We need to draw it out, Mr. Robinson. We need to get it into the open where we can kill it. And you're the connection, you're the bloodline. It will come for you eventually. It always comes for the bloodline. Bill looked at the barn, at the hanging bodies, at the nightmare that had invaded his world. He thought of Brutus, posed on his welcome mat, of Leon crawling toward his truck, of the thing that had spoken to him with almost human voice. What do I have to do? You go home, the leader said again. You wait, and when it finally comes for you, you lead it to us. And if I can't, if it kills me first. The leader smiled, and it was not a comforting expression. Then we collect what's left and try again with the next generation. The Robinson bloodline is long, Mr. Robinson. It stretches back to the beginning, and the project is patient. They left him there, surrounded by death, with the howling still echoing in his ears. Bill stood in the morning light alone, and he understood. He was not a victim. He was not bait. He was a target, and the hunt had only just begun. The military team, if that's what they were, set up operations in an abandoned textile mill 10 miles from Bill's house. They didn't ask permission. They didn't file permits. They simply arrived with trucks and equipment and armed guards and took possession of the property. The locals didn't ask questions. The authorities looked the other way. And Bill found himself living in the center of a storm that no one would acknowledge existed. They installed cameras at his house, motion sensors, tripwires. They gave him a radio that connected directly to their command center, a panic button that would bring armed response in 90 seconds. They showed him diagrams, schematics, reconstructions of what they believed the creature looked like, what it could do, how it hunted. It wasn't complete. The files from 1954 had been partially destroyed, partially redacted, partially lost to time, but what remained was enough to paint a picture of nightmare. Project Black Cat began in 1951, the leader told him, the first night in the mill. His name was Morrison, or that's what he said. No rank, no affiliation, just a name and a face that showed no emotion. The goal was to create a biological weapon, something that could infiltrate enemy territory, eliminate targets, and self-destruct if captured. By turning people into whatever that thing is. Not people, Morrison corrected. Not originally. The first phase used animals. Large cats specifically, jaguars mostly. They were given enhancements, genetic modifications, hormonal treatments. The goal was to create a predator that was smarter, faster, more lethal than anything natural. And it worked. Too well. Morrison pulled up images on a screen, classified photographs that showed creatures in cages, creatures that were recognizably feline but wrong, distorted, enhanced beyond nature's limits. The subjects developed intelligence, problem-solving ability, pack behavior, and they developed other traits. Like speaking, Morrison confirmed. The 1954 escape involved 12 subjects. We killed 11. The 12th was never found. We assumed it died in the wilderness, starved or killed by natural predators. We were wrong. It's been out there for 70 years. Hibernating. Morrison pulled up another file. Phase 2 of the project focused on longevity, on suspended animation. The theory was that an assassin that could sleep for decades, wake when needed, complete the mission, and sleep again would be the ultimate weapon. And now it's awake. And it's breeding. The attacks on your neighbor's dogs, the transformation you witnessed, that's new. That's something we didn't anticipate. The original subjects couldn't reproduce. They were sterile by design. But 70 years is a long time. Evolution works quickly when the pressure is strong enough. So it's making more. It's making an army. Morrison's voice was flat, emotionless, but his hands trembled slightly as he changed the image. We've identified 3 distinct breeding sites. The barn you found was one. We've found 2 others. Each contains offspring, hybrids, things that are learning, growing, becoming more dangerous every day. How do we stop it? We don't, not with conventional weapons. The 1954 team used specialized ammunition, armor-piercing, high-explosive, laced with toxins designed specifically for the subjects. We've recreated that ammunition. But we need to find the original, the progenitor, the thing that woke up and started all this. And to do that, he looked at Bill, and for the first time there was something in his eyes, pity or guilt. To do that, we need bait, we need the bloodline, we need you. The waiting was the worst part. Days turned into weeks, and Bill lived in a state of constant tension, waiting for the attack that was inevitable. He slept during the day when the creature was less active. He stayed inside after dark, doors locked, lights blazing, radio close at hand. He jumped at every sound, every shadow, every creak of the old house settling, and he watched the news. It was spreading. The attacks were no longer limited to Brunswick County. Reports came in from Bladen County, from Columbus County, from Pender and Onslow. Livestock killed, pets transformed, people missing. The authorities blamed coyotes, blamed feral dogs, blamed bear attacks, but Bill knew. He recognized the patterns, the claw marks, the teeth pulled, the words scratched in wood and stone. I remember. The phrase was appearing everywhere now, scratched on barn doors, written in blood on farmhouse walls, carved into tree trunks throughout the forest. A message, a warning, a promise of revenge that stretched across generations. In Greensboro, a family of 5 disappeared from their farm. The search found the bodies 3 days later, arranged in a circle in the cornfield. Each had been transformed partially, their faces still recognizable, but their bodies twisted, elongated, furred. They had been buried alive, the autopsy revealed. Buried alive and left to die as their bodies changed, as the infection spread, as they became something else. The military team, Morrison's team, retrieved the bodies before the CDC could examine them. Classified the deaths as gas leak, carbon monoxide poisoning, a tragedy but a natural one. In Lexington, a college student named Kevin Park went missing after posting a video to TikTok. The video showed him hiking in the woods, talking to the camera, joking about finding the Blair Witch. Then the camera had jerked, the image blurred, and for 3 seconds, only 3 seconds, the video had shown the creature. Standing on its hind legs, its tail lashing, its eyes glowing in the darkness. Kevin's body was found the next morning, or what was left of it. The transformation had been attempted but failed, Morrison's team reported. Kevin's immune system had rejected the infection, had fought back. The creature, enraged, had torn him apart. The video was scrubbed from the internet, the accounts deleted, the witnesses, Kevin's friends who had been with him, quietly relocated with new identities and warnings about what would happen if they talked. But Bill had seen the video. Morrison had shown it to him, and he had seen what the creature was becoming. "It's evolving," Morrison said the night they watched the footage together. "The original subject was a predator, a killer, but this is something else. It's experimenting, learning what works and what doesn't. Experimenting on humans. Experimenting on everything." Morrison pulled up maps, charts, timelines. The attacks are increasing in frequency and complexity. It's no longer just killing, it's farming. Farming. Look at the pattern. Morrison traced lines on the map connecting attack sites. It's creating zones, territories. In each zone, it establishes a breeding site. It transforms local animals, dogs, cats, livestock into workers, for lack of a better term. Things that can hunt, that can gather food, that can defend the territory. And then it moves on, expands, creates new zones. Like a virus. Exactly like a virus. Morrison's voice was grim. And like a virus, it's spreading exponentially. At current rates, within 6 months, the entire state will be compromised. Within a year, the Southeast. Within 2, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. Bill understood. They weren't fighting an animal. They were fighting an infection. A plague. Something that consumed and transformed and spread, that had no purpose beyond reproduction and domination. And it was winning. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Roy Fors, the retired police chief, 80 years old and living in a nursing home in Wilmington. He had been there in 1954, had been part of the search, had seen what the creature could do, and he had kept records. "I knew they'd come back," Fors wheezed, his oxygen tank hissing beside his bed. "Knew it was just a matter of time. The government, they always think they can control these things, but you can't control nature. You can't control evolution. You can only hope to survive it." He gave them his files. Journals, photographs, maps that he had drawn from memory, locations that matched Morrison's data with frightening accuracy. "It's not just one creature," Fors explained. "Never was. In 54 we killed the leader, the original, but there were others. Eggs, we called them, dormant. Waiting, we found 3 nests. Burned 2, but the third we never found. Your grandfather," he looked at Bill, his ancient eyes sharp, "he led the team that searched for it. Searched for 3 weeks, found nothing. And now it's hatched. Now it's hatched, and it's been growing. For 70 years it's been growing, learning, waiting, and now it's ready." "Ready for what?" Fors leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Ready to wake the others." The revelation hit Bill like a physical blow. Others, there are more. Project Black Cat wasn't limited to North Carolina. There were facilities in Arizona, in Florida, in Alaska. 12 facilities total. Each created its own subjects. Each had its own accidents. The government, they tried to keep them separate. Tried to make sure the different strains never met, because they were afraid of what would happen if they did. What would happen? Hybridization, crossbreeding, the creation of something new, something stronger. Fors coughed, a wet, rattling sound that spoke of lungs filled with fluid and fear. "The thing that's hunting you, Bill, it's not just a black cat subject, it's something else. Something that's survived for 70 years by adapting, by evolving, and now that it's awake, now that it's strong, it's going to find the others." "How?" "It remembers. That's what the words mean. I remember. It remembers the other facilities, the other subjects, the locations, the procedures, the genetic codes. It's been waiting for this, planning for this. For 70 years it's been preparing, and now it's time." Morrison confirmed the theory. The military files, the ones that hadn't been destroyed, spoke of Phase 3, the merging of strains, the creation of a superior organism, the ultimate biological weapon. "We have to stop it," Bill said. "Before it finds the others, before it can hybridize." "We have to kill it," Morrison agreed. "But to do that, we have to find it, and to find it," he looked at Bill, "we need you." The plan was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. Bill would return to his house. He would wait until dark. He would go outside, make himself visible, and hope that the creature came for him. When it did, the team would be waiting. Snipers positioned in the trees, explosives buried in the yard, traps of wire and fire and poison. They would surround it, contain it, and destroy it. Simple, and almost certainly fatal. "Why me?" Bill asked the night before the operation. "Why does it want me specifically?" "Blood," Morrison said. "Blood and memory. Your grandfather killed its parent, killed its siblings. It remembers that. And it wants revenge, not just on you, on your entire line. So if I die, it moves on to the next generation. Your children, your grandchildren." Morrison's voice was cold, clinical. "The Robinson bloodline is marked, has been marked since 1954. It will never stop hunting you, never stop feeding on you unless we end it." Bill thought of his daughter, living in Raleigh with her husband and their 2-year-old son. Thought of the life they were building, the future they were planning. Thought of how easily it could all be destroyed. "I'll do it," he said. The night was moonless, overcast, the darkness absolute. Bill sat on his porch, his shotgun across his knees, and he waited. The house behind him was empty, evacuated, rigged with explosives that would detonate if the creature breached the walls. The yard was a killing field, every inch covered by overlapping fields of fire. He was bait, and he was ready. The howling started at midnight, closer this time, much closer, coming from the woods behind the house, from the oak tree where Brutus was buried, from the grave that had been opened and emptied and filled with something else. Bill stood. He walked to the edge of the porch, into the yard, and he called out. "I'm here," he shouted. "I'm here, you bastard, come and get me." Silence. The howling stopped. The world held its breath, and then from the darkness came the voice. Little Robinson. It was the same voice from before, almost human but wrong, the syllables stretched and distorted by a mouth never meant for speech. "You came back. I knew you would. You humans, you never learn." "Show yourself," Bill screamed, his voice cracking. "I am showing myself." The voice came from everywhere, from nowhere, from the darkness itself. "I am all around you. I am in the trees. I am in the ground. I am in the blood that flows through your veins." Bill turned, trying to locate the source. And then he saw it. It wasn't alone. The yard was full of them, dozens of shapes emerging from the darkness, from the trees, from the earth itself. The creatures, the offspring, the transformed. There were dogs, or things that had been dogs, pit bulls mostly, like Brutus, like Leon's dogs, their bodies elongated, their faces stretched, their teeth too numerous. There were cats, mountain lions, bobcats, all twisted into new shapes, new configurations. There were deer, raccoons, even a bear, all bearing the marks of transformation, all moving with the same fluid grace, the same predatory intent. And in the center of them all, the progenitor, the original, the thing that had been hunting Bill's family for 70 years. It had grown since he last saw it, grown and changed. Its body was larger, more muscular, covered in a pelt that seemed to absorb the darkness itself. But the face was what held his attention. The face was almost human now, almost recognizable. The features were refined, symmetrical, beautiful in a terrible way. The eyes were human-shaped, but the pupils were slitted, glowing with that terrible yellow light. "You wanted me," the creature said, stepping forward. "Here I am." "Now," Bill screamed. The trap sprung. Spotlights blazed to life, illuminating the yard in harsh white glare. Gunfire erupted from the trees, automatic weapons chattering, muzzle flashes strobing. Explosives detonated, ripping through the ranks of transformed creatures, sending bodies flying, limbs spinning through the air. But the progenitor didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. It simply smiled, showing teeth that were too numerous, too perfect, too sharp. "Did you think I didn't know?" it asked, its voice carrying over the gunfire, over the explosions, over Bill's screams. "Did you think I couldn't smell your fear, your desperation? I have been hunting humans for 70 years, little Robinson. I know your traps, I know your tricks. I allowed this. I wanted you all in one place." It raised a hand, not a paw, a human hand with 5 fingers and an opposable thumb, and gestured. The gunfire stopped, not because the shooters had stopped firing, but because the shooters were dead. Bill turned, saw the bodies falling from the trees, saw the things that had been climbing while they waited, that had circled around, that had attacked from behind. The trap had been turned. They were surrounded. "Run," the creature said. "Run, and I will give you a head start, just as I gave your grandfather, just as I gave your father. Run, and let us see how far the bloodline can flee before the harvest comes due." Bill ran. He dropped the shotgun, useless now, and he ran. Through the yard, through the woods, into the darkness. Behind him, the creature laughed, and the sound followed him like a promise of death. He ran for miles. His lungs burned, his legs screamed, his heart hammered against his ribs. He ran through streams, hoping to break the trail. He ran through briars, feeling the thorns tear his skin, not caring. He ran until he couldn't run anymore, collapsing against a tree, gasping for air, waiting for the end. It didn't come. The forest was silent. The laughter had stopped. Bill climbed a tree, hiding in the branches, clutching his radio, though he knew no one would answer. He waited until dawn, shaking, freezing, his body battered and exhausted. When the sun rose, he climbed down, made his way back to the road, walked to the nearest house, pounded on the door, begged for help. The military came, Morrison's team or what was left of it. They found the bodies at Bill's house, the slaughter in the woods, the evidence of the ambush. They extracted Bill, debriefed him, and told him what he already knew. The operation had failed. The creature was still alive. And now it knew their methods, their capabilities, their weaknesses. "We need a new plan," Morrison said, his face haggard, his voice hoarse. "There is no new plan," Bill said. "It knows everything. It's smarter than us. It's been planning for 70 years. Then we go back to the source." Morrison pulled out the files from 1954 from Project Black Cat. "We find the original research, the original scientists. We find out how they controlled the subjects, how they contained them." "They didn't contain them," Bill pointed out. "They escaped, they killed, they destroyed the entire project. But they also killed them, 11 out of 12. They found a way." Morrison's eyes were bright, feverish. "The records from '54, your grandfather's notes, they're still out there, buried, hidden, if we can find them." "If we can find them, what? We still have to find the creature. We still have to kill it. The notes might tell us how, might tell us what it fears, what can hurt it." Bill thought of the creature's face, the almost human features, the terrible intelligence in its eyes. "It fears something," he said slowly. "It must. Everything fears something. Then we find out what, and we use it." They spent the next week searching, digging through archives, interviewing survivors, tracking down the few scientists from Project Black Cat who were still alive. They found fragments, pieces, hints of the truth. The creatures had been designed to fear fire. That was in the original specifications, a failsafe in case containment failed. Their skin was sensitive to heat, their nervous systems wired to respond to flame with paralyzing terror. But the progenitor had evolved, had adapted. The fire that would have stopped its parent might not stop it. They needed something else, something stronger. They found it in the most unexpected place, in Leon Williams' security footage, in the 3 seconds of video showing the creature in the barn. In the background, barely visible, there had been something else, something the creature was avoiding, a grain silo. "It's a trap," Morrison said, studying the footage. "Look at the way it's positioned. The creature enters from the side, never the front. It circles around, keeping distance." "Why?" "I don't know, but whatever is in that silo, the creature fears it." They researched the farm. The Williams family had owned it for generations. The silo was old, built in the 1920s, decommissioned in the 1980s, but it was still standing, still full of something. "Napalm," Bill said, realization dawning. "My grandfather told stories about the war, about using napalm in the Pacific. He said it was the most terrifying weapon he ever saw, that nothing could survive it. The military still has stockpiles, from Vietnam." Morrison was already on his phone, making calls, pulling strings. "If we can lure the creature into the silo, if we can trap it there." "How do we lure it?" Bill asked. "It knows our tricks. It won't fall for the same trap twice." "It won't fall for a trap," Morrison agreed. "But it will follow blood." He looked at Bill. "The bloodline," he said. "It wants you, not just as bait, as tribute, as payment for what your grandfather did. If you go to the silo, if you call it there, it will come. And then we burn it. And then we burn it." Bill thought of his daughter, his grandson, the future he was fighting for. "I'll do it," he said, "but I want insurance. I want a way out." "There is no way out," Morrison said. "Not for you. Not if you go into that silo. The only way this works is if you're inside when the fire starts, if the creature thinks it's won." Bill closed his eyes. "Then I die." "Then you die, but you die saving your family, saving everyone, ending this." "And if it doesn't work, if the fire doesn't kill it," Morrison's silence was answer enough, "then God help us all." The grain silo stood at the edge of the Williams farm, a concrete cylinder 50 feet high and 30 feet across, its sides stained with rust and age, its roof collapsed inward decades ago. Inside was darkness, A hollow space filled with the debris of decades, with rotting grain and nesting birds and the bones of animals that had wandered in and never found their way out. And something else. Something that Morrison's team had installed in the night, working under cover of darkness, avoiding the creature's patrols. Something that would turn the silo into a furnace. 500 gallons of military-grade napalm pumped into the base, rigged with detonators surrounded by accelerant. When it blew, the temperature would reach 2,000 degrees. Concrete would melt. Steel would flow like water. Nothing organic would survive. Nothing. Bill stood at the entrance, looking into the darkness. Behind him, the team was in position. Snipers in the trees, spotters on the roof, mortar teams ready to rain fire if anything went wrong. They had set a perimeter, a kill zone, a boundary that the creature would have to cross to reach him. They had also set the trap, the lure, the bait, Bill's blood. He had cut himself deep enough to flow freely, painting the entrance to the silo with crimson. The creature could smell blood from miles away, Morrison had said, could track a wounded human across any terrain through any obstacle. The scent of Robinson blood would be irresistible. It will come, Morrison had promised. It will come for you, and when it enters the silo, when it thinks it has you cornered, we close the door, and we burn it. And me. There's an escape tunnel. Morrison had shown him the plans, the schematics, the narrow shaft that led from the silo's base to a drainage ditch 200 yards away. You'll have 60 seconds from the time the creature enters. 60 seconds to get to the tunnel, get through, get clear. Then we detonate. And if I don't make it, Morrison had looked at him with eyes that had seen too much death, then you die a hero, and we try again with the next generation. The sun was setting, the shadows lengthening, the howling beginning. It was closer tonight, closer than ever before. The creature knew something was happening. It could smell the tension, the fear, the preparations. It was being cautious, being patient, but it was also being hungry. The howling reached a crescendo, a chorus of transformed creatures surrounding the farm, surrounding the silo, surrounding Bill. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The army that the progenitor had built over 70 years. And in the center of it all, the progenitor itself. Walking on two legs now, fully transformed, its body covered in sleek black fur that absorbed the dying light. Its face was beautiful, terrible, angelic, and demonic at once. The face of a god, the face of a devil. Little Robinson, it called, its voice carrying across the fields, across the distance, directly into Bill's mind. I have waited for this. For 70 years I have waited. Your grandfather thought he could end me. Your father thought he could hide from me. And now you think you can kill me. I can kill you, Bill shouted, his voice trembling. I will kill you. No, the creature smiled, showing teeth that were too perfect, too numerous. You will join me. You will become me. Your blood is strong, little Robinson, stronger than your grandfather's, stronger than your father's. You will make a fine addition to my collection. It moved forward, crossing the perimeter, entering the kill zone. The snipers tensed, but Morrison held them back. Wait, his signal said. Wait for it to enter the silo. Bill backed into the darkness, into the hollow space, feeling his way through the debris. The creature followed, its eyes glowing, its tail lashing, its hands, human hands, perfect hands reaching out. Run, it whispered. Run and see how far you get. Bill ran. He stumbled through the darkness, tripping over debris, feeling his way toward the tunnel entrance. Behind him, the creature laughed, following at a walk, savoring the hunt. 30 seconds. He found the tunnel entrance, a narrow hole in the floor, barely big enough to crawl through. He dropped to his knees, began to squeeze into the darkness. Where are you going? The creature asked, its voice right behind him. There is no escape, little Robinson. There is only the transformation, the becoming, the harvest. A hand closed around Bill's ankle, claws digging deep, severing tendons, shredding muscle. Bill screamed, thrashing, trying to pull away. You are mine, the creature said, pulling him back, dragging him out of the tunnel. You have always been mine, since 1954, since the beginning. Your bloodline belongs to me. It lifted him, holding him by the throat, its face inches from his, its breath hot and coppery and wrong. "Look at me," it commanded. "Look at what you will become." Bill looked, saw the perfection of the face, the symmetry, the terrible beauty, saw the intelligence in the eyes, the ancient wisdom, the endless hunger, and he understood. This was not a monster, this was evolution, the next step, the future. "No," he whispered. "Yes," the creature said, and it bit him. The fangs entered his neck, piercing the carotid, pumping venom directly into his bloodstream. Bill felt the fire spread, felt the transformation begin, felt his body changing, becoming, evolving. No, not like this. Not without a fight. He reached into his pocket, found the detonator Morrison had given him. The dead man's switch. The last resort. "If you don't make it," Morrison had said, "if the creature catches you, press the button. It won't save you, but it will take the creature with you." Bill pressed the button. The explosion was instant, absolute, consuming. The napalm ignited in a fireball that filled the silo, that reached temperatures hot enough to vaporize concrete, to melt steel, to turn flesh to ash. The creature screamed. For the first time it screamed, its perfect voice cracking, its perfect face contorting in agony. It dropped Bill, tried to run, but the fire was everywhere, consuming everything, a furnace that had no escape. Bill lay on the ground, burning, transforming, dying. He watched the creature thrash, watched its skin blister and peel, watched its perfect form melt into something terrible, something ugly, something that was finally, truly a monster. "I remember," Bill whispered, the words bubbling through blood and fire. "I remember 1954. I remember Project Black Cat. I remember what you are, and I remember how to kill you." The creature turned, its face ruined, its eyes blinded, and tried to speak. But the fire had consumed its voice, its lungs, its mind. It died screaming, died burning, died remembering, finally, what it meant to be afraid. The silo collapsed inward, concrete walls melting, falling, burying the creature under tons of rubble and ash. The fire continued for hours, fed by the accelerant, reaching temperatures that would ensure nothing survived. Nothing. They found Bill's body in the drainage ditch, 50 yards from the silo. He had made it through the tunnel somehow, crawling through the darkness while his body burned. He had died in the ditch, his skin charred, his bones exposed, but his face peaceful. He had won. The creature was dead. The progenitor was destroyed. The army of transformed creatures without their leader, without their source of new transformation, began to die. The infection in their blood, no longer sustained by the progenitor's power, turned toxic. They rotted where they stood, their stolen lives finally ending. The crisis was over, the threat was ended. Project Black Cat could finally be buried for good, but Morrison knew better. He had seen the files, had read about the other facilities, the other subjects, the other progenitors waiting to wake. This was not the end. This was just the beginning. 6 months later, a military drone flying over the Arizona desert picked up a heat signature. Large, bipedal, moving with purpose toward a facility that had been sealed in 1958. The operator zoomed in, enhanced the image, and felt his blood freeze. It was walking on 2 legs, but its body was wrong. The proportions were feline, but the height was human. Its face, it had a face, not a muzzle, not a snout, was turned toward the camera, its eyes glowing with yellow light. And it was smiling. The operator reported the sighting. Command ordered him to delete the footage, to forget what he had seen, to report for reassignment. He did as he was told, but he kept a copy, hidden, encrypted, waiting. Because he had seen the files too, had heard the stories, and he knew that Project Black Cat was not the only experiment, that there were others, that they were waking up, that the harvest was just beginning. On his last day, he added a note to the file, a warning for whoever found it next. Containment protocol failed, and below it, they are not alone, they were never alone, and they are coming. In the ashes of the silo, something stirred. Deep underground where the fire had not reached, where the heat had not penetrated, where the concrete had shielded it from destruction. Eggs, dozens of them, hibernating, waiting. And in the largest, the one at the center, something was moving, growing, remembering. The progenitor had died, but the progenitor's child was waking, stronger, smarter, more patient than its parent. It had learned from the mistakes of the past, had learned what fire could do, had learned to fear, to be cautious, to wait for the perfect moment. And it had learned something else, something that made its first movements a dance of joy. It could feel them, the others, the progenitors from the other facilities. They were waking too, stretching, preparing. The time of isolation was ending. The time of gathering was beginning. Soon they would meet. Soon they would combine. Soon they would become what Project Black Cat had always intended. The ultimate predator, the ultimate weapon, the ultimate harvest. And humans, frail, weak, foolish humans, would finally learn what it meant to be prey. Bill Robinson was buried in a military cemetery, his service recognized, his sacrifice honored. His name was added to a wall, alongside others who had died in operations that never officially existed. His daughter came to the funeral, her son in her arms. She didn't understand why her father had died, what he had been fighting, why the government refused to explain. But she knew somehow that he had saved her, had saved them all. She placed flowers on his grave, said a prayer, and walked away. Behind her, something moved in the tree line, something with yellow eyes and a smile full of teeth. It watched her go, watched the child, calculated the bloodline, the genetics, the potential. Not yet, but soon. Soon the harvest would begin again, and the Robinson bloodline would finally, completely be consumed. The creature turned and vanished into the forest, leaving only the echo of its laughter and the words scratched into the bark of the nearest tree. I remember, the forest was silent, the forest was watching, the forest was hungry, and the harvest was never truly over. The final scene, captured by a hunter's trail camera in the mountains of Alaska 3 years later, showed a shape moving through the snow. Not walking, not running, flowing like water, like shadow. It wore clothes, human clothes, a jacket, pants, boots, the clothes of someone who had been taken, consumed, worn like a skin. The face was human, beautiful, perfect. The face of a friend, a neighbor, someone you would trust, would invite in, would never suspect. Until the teeth showed, until the eyes glowed, until the voice spoke in words that were almost human, almost kind, almost loving. Come out, it whispered to the camera, to the hunter who would find it days later, to the world that thought it was safe. The night is young, the hunt is on, and I am so very hungry. The video ended. The camera was destroyed. The hunter was found 3 weeks later, his body arranged in a circle, his skin flayed, his organs missing, his face frozen in an expression of terrible understanding. I remember was written in the snow around him. The war was not over. The war was eternal, and humanity was losing. 5 years after the destruction of the North Carolina progenitor, the reports began again. Not in Brunswick County, not in North Carolina, but everywhere. Montana, Oregon, Alaska, Arizona, Florida. Missing persons, mutilated livestock, strange tracks, words written in blood. I remember, the government created task forces, the military deployed special units. The media was silenced, the witnesses disappeared, the truth buried under layers of classification. But the people knew, the people remembered, the people who had lost family, friends, neighbors. They knew what was coming, and they prepared. In basements and bunkers, in remote cabins and secret compounds, they gathered weapons and supplies and knowledge. They studied the old files, the Project Black Cat documents, the accounts of survivors. They learned what worked and what didn't, what could kill the creatures and what only made them angry. They learned that fire could hurt them but not always kill them, that explosives could slow them but not stop them, that bullets were useless unless they were silver, blessed, or explosive. They learned that the creatures feared running water, that they couldn't cross it without pain. They learned that they were vulnerable during transformation, when their bodies were changing, when they were neither one thing nor another. They learned that the only sure way to kill them was complete destruction, burning to ash, drowning, burial in consecrated ground. And they learned that there was never just one, that where one appeared, others followed, that they were connected somehow across distances, sharing knowledge, sharing memories, sharing blood. The war had gone underground, gone quiet, but it had not ended. In the darkness, in the shadows, in the places where humans didn't look, the creatures were breeding, multiplying, spreading. The harvest continued. And somewhere in a facility that didn't exist, a computer screen flickered to life. A map appeared showing heat signatures, dozens of them, hundreds, spreading outward from 12 points like ripples in a pond. The containment protocol had failed. The Phase 3 had begun, and humanity's time was running out. The final image, captured by a satellite in geosynchronous orbit over North America, showed the continent at night. The lights of cities, of towns, of civilization, and between them in the darkness of the wild places, dozens of new lights, yellow, glowing, moving. The creatures were gathering, the progenitors were meeting. The harvest was about to begin in earnest. And this time there would be no escape, no hiding, no waiting for the fire to come. This time the creatures would win. The screen went dark, the transmission ended, and in the silence that followed, something howled. A howl that was answered, and answered again, and again, until the chorus stretched from coast to coast, from border to border, from the frozen north to the tropical south. The blood harvest had begun, and it would not end until the last human fell. In the years that followed, the stories became legends. The legends became myths. The myths became religion. The Church of the Harvest taught that the creatures were gods, ancient beings who had ruled the earth before humans, who would rule again after humans were gone, who were cleansing the world of the weak, the unworthy, preparing the way for a new species, a better species. The resistance fought against the creatures, using every weapon at their disposal. They died by the thousands, by the millions, but they never stopped fighting, because they knew that surrender meant extinction, that submission meant transformation. And in the middle, the survivors, the ones who hid, who ran, who tried to wait out the storm. They lived in enclaves, in fortresses, in prisons of their own making. They farmed, they bred, they tried to rebuild. And they waited for the day when the creatures would finally die, when the infection would burn itself out, when the harvest would end. But the creatures were patient. They had waited 70 years to wake. They could wait 70 more. The war lasted generations. The bloodline of Project Black Cat continued, spreading, evolving, becoming stronger with each passing year. The progenitors bred true, creating new generations of hunters, of killers, of transformers, and the humans grew weaker, fewer, more desperate, until one day the last human died, the last voice was silenced, the last light went out. And the creatures inherited the earth. They ruled for 10,000 years. They built cities, civilizations, empires that spanned continents. They evolved further, becoming more than they had been, less than they had been made to be. They became gods, devils, legends. And then one day they too began to die. The infection that had made them strong became their weakness. The genetic modifications that had given them power became their curse. They sickened, they weakened, they faded, and finally the last of them died. The last progenitor, the last descendant of Project Black Cat. The earth was empty. The harvest was over. But in the ruins of the old facilities, in the depths of the silos and bunkers and secret labs, the eggs remained, hibernating, waiting for new hosts, new blood, new generations. The cycle would begin again. It always did, because the harvest was eternal. The hunger was endless, and the creatures would always return. I remember. The words were scratched into stone, into metal, into the very bones of the earth. A promise, a warning, a prophecy. Someday the stars would align, the conditions would be right, and the eggs would hatch. The blood harvest would begin again, and the universe would tremble. The laboratory in the Nevada desert had been abandoned for decades, its entrances sealed with concrete, its existence erased from maps and records and human memory. But deep underground, where the sun had never reached, something still lived, something still waited. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to the forensic archaeologist from Minnesota, though they shared the same name and the same fate, discovered the facility by accident. She was a geologist, studying fault lines when her sensors detected the hollow space. She drilled, she excavated, she entered. And she found the nursery. Rows upon rows of tanks filled with fluid that glowed with its own faint luminescence, and in each tank curled like fetuses were creatures, small, helpless, sleeping. The labels on the tanks told the story: Project Black Cat, Phase 4, the final phase, the perfection of the weapon. Sarah stared at the creatures, her scientific mind warring with her human instincts. They were beautiful in a terrible way. Perfect predators, evolved beyond nature, designed to be the ultimate hunters, and they were waking up. One of the tanks was empty, the fluid drained, the creature gone. Sarah heard the sound behind her, the soft breathing, the gentle movement. She turned slowly and saw it. It stood 3 feet tall, bipedal, its body covered in fine black fur that absorbed the light. Its face was humanoid, beautiful, with large eyes that glowed yellow in the darkness. "Hello," it said, its voice like music. "I've been waiting for you." Sarah ran. She made it to the entrance before it caught her, before it showed her what the final phase really meant, before she understood that the creatures had never been designed to replace humans. They had been designed to become humans, to wear human skin, to live human lives, to hunt from within. The final phase was not conquest, it was infiltration. The creature that emerged from the Nevada facility looked exactly like Dr. Sarah Chen. It wore her clothes, her face, her memories. It walked out of the desert and into the world, and no one suspected a thing. It took 3 years to reach Washington. 3 years of travel, of learning, of preparation. 3 years of finding others like itself, other Phase 4 subjects that had awakened in other facilities, other countries, other continents. They gathered in the capital, 12 of them, the 12 progenitors of the final phase, the architects of the new world, and they began to work. The infiltration was subtle at first. A senator here, a general there, a journalist, a judge, a president. They took positions of power, of influence, of control. They shaped policy, directed resources, prepared the way. And when the time was right, when the world was ready, they struck. Not with claws, not with teeth, with laws, with orders, with the machinery of state. They declared martial law. They rounded up the infected, the carriers, the threats to national security. They created camps, laboratories, processing centers. They used the very language of Project Black Cat, the very procedures, the very methods. But this time the subjects were human, and the experiment was the entire species. The transformation centers worked day and night. Humans entered, creatures emerged. The process was perfected now, streamlined, efficient. Within 6 months, half the world's population had been converted. Within a year, the resistance was crushed. Within 2, the last human died. And the creatures inherited not just the earth but everything humans had built. The cities, the technology, the knowledge. They were the perfect successors, the perfect inheritors, the perfect predators, and they were still hungry. The scout ship descended on the alien world, its sensors detecting life, civilization, cities. The crew prepared for first contact, for diplomacy, for the peaceful exchange of knowledge. They found the cities empty, the buildings intact, the machines still running but no inhabitants, no bodies, no sign of what had happened. And then they heard it, the howling, the calling, the hunting cry of something that had evolved beyond their understanding. The creatures emerged from the shadows, from the buildings, from the ground itself. Thousands of them, millions, An army of perfect predators adapted to any environment, capable of any transformation. The crew fought. They died. They were consumed. And their ship became the vessel that carried the infection to the stars. The blood harvest had gone interstellar. The creatures had become cosmic. They spread from world to world, consuming, transforming, adapting. They became the ultimate life form, the perfect organism, the final solution to the problem of existence. And still, they remembered. I remember. The words echoed across galaxies, written in the dust of dead worlds, scratched into the hulls of derelict ships, broadcast on frequencies that no one had used for millennia. They remembered Earth, remembered Project Black Cat, remembered the humans who had created them, who had tried to control them, who had become them. They remembered the blood, and they were grateful, for without the humans, without the project, without the desperate attempt to create the ultimate weapon, they would not exist. They were the legacy of humanity, the children of genocide, the inheritors of extinction, and they would carry that memory forward forever. Until the last star died, until the last planet froze, until the universe itself went dark, and even then they would remember. The blood harvest was eternal, the hunger never ended, and they would always, always be grateful to the ones who had made them possible, the humans, the creators, the first harvest. I remember. The final words broadcast from the last remaining creature as the universe died around it, spoken with love, with gratitude, with hunger. I remember you. I remember what you made me. I remember the blood. And I thank you for the harvest, for the hunger, for eternity. The universe went dark, the creature closed its eyes, and it dreamed of new universes, new life, new blood, and it knew that one day, somewhere, somehow, it would all begin again. The cycle was eternal, the harvest never ended, and they would always remember. Final transmission. Date unknown, location unknown, sender unknown. If you are hearing this, it is too late. The creatures are here, they have always been here, they will always be here. We tried to stop them, we tried to kill them. We tried to burn them, drown them, bury them. Nothing worked, nothing ever works. They are not animals, they are not monsters, they are evolution, the future, the next step. And we are the past, the obsolete, the food. If you are human, run, hide, pray. But know that prayer will not save you, nothing will save you. The harvest is eternal. The blood remembers. And they are always hungry. The transmission ended in static, in silence, in the darkness that comes before the dawn, and in the distance something howled. The blood harvest continues, forever. The Slide Rock Bolter Devourer of the Peaks. The radio crackled with static, a harsh electric whisper cutting through the crystalline mountain air like a blade through silk. Ranger Dennis McCall's hands trembled as he clutched the transmitter, his knuckles white against the black rubber casing, his breath coming in ragged gasps that fogged the microphone in rapid bursts of condensation. The evening sun had already begun its descent behind the jagged peaks of the never-summer mountains, painting the snow-capped summits in shades of blood orange and bruised purple. But Dennis saw none of the beauty that had drawn him to this posting 3 years ago. His eyes were fixed on the ridge line to the east, where something impossible was happening, something that his rational mind refused to process even as his eyes bore witness to the atrocity unfolding before him. Mayday, Mayday, this is Ranger Station 7, Dennis McCall. I have a code red situation. Repeat, code red, over. His voice wavered, breaking on the final syllable as the ground beneath his boots began to vibrate with a low, subsonic rumble that resonated in his chest cavity and made his teeth ache. The vibration wasn't the sharp jolt of an earthquake, nor the rolling waves of tectonic shifting he'd experienced once during his training in California. This was different, rhythmic, purposeful, like the heartbeat of something vast and ancient stirring from eons of slumber. Through the binoculars he kept permanently looped around his neck, Dennis watched the eastern ridge begin to shimmer. Not with heat haze, that would have been normal, expected even on a warm autumn afternoon, but with actual movement. The entire ridgeline, a granite spine that had stood unmoving for millions of years, was undulating like a serpent awakening from hibernation. Boulders the size of compact cars tumbled from the crest, bouncing and crashing down the slope in a cascade of stone that should have signaled a simple rock slide, a natural hazard that rangers dealt with every season. But rocks didn't scream. The sound that reached Dennis's ears through the thin mountain air was unlike anything he had ever heard in his 38 years of life. It began as a wet, sucking noise, like a boot being pulled from thick mud, but amplified to tectonic proportions. Then came the screams, human screams, 12 of them in rapid succession, overlapping and merging into a single sustained note of pure agony that made Dennis's bladder release in a hot rush down his legs. The university hiking group that had checked in that morning, the cheerful graduate students from Boulder who had laughed and joked about needing to get back to nature before their thesis deadlines, were being consumed by something that had no right to exist in any rational universe. Christ, it took the whole group. Dennis shrieked into the radio, his professional composure shattered like the granite crumbling on the distant slope. Just slid down the mountain like it was nothing, blood and, oh God. His words dissolved into incoherent babbling as he watched the thing reveal itself fully. The ridge wasn't simply sliding, it was opening. A maw of impossible dimensions yawned wide, lined not with teeth in the traditional sense, but with jagged mineral formations that had been worn by millennia of erosion into serrated, crystalline points. The interior of the mouth glistened with a viscous, opalescent slime that caught the dying sunlight and refracted it into rainbow patterns that were grotesquely beautiful against the carnage they lubricated. The creature moved with a fluid grace that belied its massive bulk. Dennis estimated it to be at least 300 feet from the hooked flukes of its tail to the cavernous maw that now snapped shut with a sound like 1,000 tombstones slamming together. The vibration knocked him off his feet, sending him sprawling onto the observation deck boards with enough force to split his lip against the radio handset. Blood filled his mouth, coppery and warm, but he barely noticed as he scrambled backward on hands and knees, desperate to put distance between himself and the abomination that was now turning, its entire bulk rotating with the inexorable momentum of a glacier to face his direction. It had no eyes that Dennis could see, only smooth expanses of stone-like hide that blended perfectly with the surrounding rock formations. But he felt its attention focus on him nonetheless, a palpable weight that pressed against his consciousness like a physical force. The air grew thick with the stench of its breath, sulphurous and ancient, redolent of deep places where sunlight had never penetrated, and pressure had transformed organic matter into something else entirely. The smell was that of a meat locker left unattended for decades, of sulfur vents and anaerobic decay, of the Earth's own digestive processes exposed to the open air. "Please, oh God, please," Dennis whispered, not into the radio but to whatever deity might be listening, to any power that could save him from the geological nightmare that was now sliding down the slope toward the ranger station with terrifying speed. The creature didn't run. It didn't need to. It simply allowed gravity to take hold of its massive form, its underside somehow gripping the stone in ways that defied physics, propelling it forward in a controlled avalanche of living rock. The radio chose that moment to emit a burst of static so loud it sounded like screaming, and then went dead. Dennis didn't notice. He was already running, abandoning his post, his duty, and any hope of understanding what he had witnessed in favor of pure animal survival. His boots pounded against the wooden stairs as he descended from the observation deck, taking them 3 at a time in his panic. Behind him, the sound of splintering wood and rending metal filled the air as the creature's bulk slammed into the ranger station with the force of a freight train. The hooks on its underside, massive, curved protrusions of horn-like material that resembled the flukes of a whale crossed with the talons of some prehistoric bird, tore through the structure's foundation, lifting the entire building off its pylons and flipping it like a child's toy. Dennis felt the displaced air buffet him as he reached the tree line, the shockwave of the impact knocking him face first into a cluster of wild raspberry bushes. Thorns raked his face, drawing parallel lines of blood across his cheeks and forehead, but the pain was distant, unimportant compared to the need to escape. He scrambled to his feet and plunged into the forest, not daring to look back, his mind already beginning the process of dissociation that would eventually leave him catatonic in a psychiatric facility 300 miles away, mouthing words about mountains that hungered and hooks that dragged men into the sky. The creature didn't pursue him. It had already fed, after all, and the Lone Ranger scrambling through the underbrush was hardly worth the effort when digestion awaited. The bolter, ancient and patient, settled into the depression where the ranger station had stood, its massive form draping over the ruins like a cat curling up on a soft cushion. From deep within its gizzard, the wet sounds of grinding continued for several hours, bones being pulverized, flesh being compressed and liquefied, the 12 graduate students being reduced to nutrient slurry that would sustain the creature for another season. When the search and rescue teams arrived 3 days later, following the automated distress signal from the ranger station's emergency beacon, they found only a scar in the mountainside where the creature had descended, a swath of destruction 50 feet wide that looked exactly like a rock slide. The ranger station was gone, scattered across the slope in fragments no larger than matchsticks. Of Dennis McCall, they found only his radio, its casing cracked and its circuits fried, lying at the base of an ancient Douglas fir. The battery had been removed, or perhaps dissolved, and in its place was a single perfect sphere of polished granite, smooth as glass and warm to the touch, as if it had been recently expelled from somewhere deep and intestinal. The official report called it a tragic accident. The university hiking group had been caught in a sudden rockslide triggered by unusual freeze-thaw conditions. Ranger McCall had apparently suffered a psychotic break and destroyed his own station before fleeing into the wilderness. A brief search was conducted, but after 2 weeks with no sign of the missing ranger, the case was closed. The granite sphere was logged as evidence, placed in a box in a storage facility in Denver, and promptly forgotten. It would be another 3 months before anyone else encountered the bolter, and by then the body count would make the incident impossible to ignore. But for now, the creature slept, its belly full, its dreams slow and stony and patient. The mountains had fed and they would feed again. They had all the time in the world. Myra Takeda had never been a religious woman, but she found herself praying as she stumbled through the alpine meadow, her boots long since lost to the muck of a stream crossing, her feet bleeding and numb from miles of walking on stone and ice. The prayers weren't to any god she had learned about in her childhood, Buddhist chants from her grandmother, or the Christian hymns her American father had half-heartedly attempted to teach her. These were older prayers, wordless pleas that originated in the reptilian core of her brain, the part that understood about predators and prey, and the thin veneer of civilization that separated humans from the food chain. She had been walking for 4 days, or perhaps 5. Time had become fluid, meaningless after what she had witnessed on the trail. The sun rose and set, painting the sky in colors that seemed obscene in their beauty, and Myra kept moving, kept putting one foot in front of the other, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant madness. The hiking group had been her idea. 12 graduate students from CU Boulder, all friends or friends of friends, all eager to escape the stress of thesis deadlines and departmental politics for one last weekend in the wilderness before winter closed the high country trails. Myra had organized everything: the permits, the transportation, the route planning. She had been proud of her competence, of her ability to coordinate a dozen academics into a functional unit capable of surviving 3 days in the backcountry. She had even packed extra first aid supplies, extra food, extra water purification tablets, because she was the responsible one, the one who thought ahead. She hadn't thought ahead enough. They had reached the ridgeline at noon on the second day, panting and triumphant, 12 bodies radiating heat and endorphins as they stood at the top of the world and looked down at the valleys spreading out below them like a topographical map. Someone had produced a bottle of cheap whiskey, and they had passed it around, each taking a swig to celebrate their achievement. Myra remembered laughing, her face flushed with sun and alcohol, and the pure joy of being alive and young and surrounded by friends in one of the most beautiful places on Earth. Then the mountain moved. Not a rock slide. She would hold to that until her dying day, though the psychiatrists would try to convince her otherwise, would nod and make notes on their clipboards and speak in soft voices about trauma-induced hallucinations and the brain's attempt to make sense of catastrophic events. Myra knew what she had seen. The entire ridgeline, the solid granite spine that had supported their weight moments before, had simply opened up like a mouth and swallowed them whole. The sound came first, a wet, tearing sound, like fabric ripping but amplified to the volume of thunder. Then the screams, 12 voices becoming one, rising and falling in a terrible harmony. Myra had been standing slightly apart from the group, adjusting her pack straps, which is why she saw it clearly while the others had their backs turned to the impending doom. She saw the stone itself flex, the mineral veins in the granite widening into something like lips, the fissures that geologists would have called natural stress fractures yawning wide to reveal a gullet lined with crystalline teeth that caught the sunlight and threw it back in fractured, blood-colored shards. She saw the hooks, massive curved projections that emerged from the creature's underside like the talons of some impossible bird of prey. Each one longer than a man was tall and sharp enough to split granite. She saw them sink into the stone with terrible precision, anchoring the beast as it lunged forward, its bulk somehow defying gravity as it slid down the slope with the momentum of an avalanche but the purpose of a predator. Marcus, a doctoral candidate in environmental science who had been Myra's study partner for 2 years, had been closest to the creature's maw. He had time to turn, time to see what was coming for him, time to scream Myra's name before the teeth closed around his torso. The sound of his spine snapping had been audible even over the roar of the creature's passage, a wet crack like a branch breaking under heavy snow. Then he was gone, pulled into the darkness of the creature's throat, his legs still kicking uselessly as the teeth ground him into paste. Sarah, a tiny woman who studied lichen ecology and always carried chocolate in her pockets, had tried to run. She made it 3 steps before the creature's fluke tail, a massive, flattened appendage that seemed to be made of compressed stone, swept across the ridge with the force of a wrecking ball. The impact lifted her off her feet and sent her tumbling through the air, her body rag-dolling in a way that made it clear her neck had broken instantly. She landed 30 feet down the slope, already dead, her skull crushed by the impact, but the creature wasn't done with her. The hooks on its underside caught her body as it swept past, impaling her through the chest and abdomen, carrying her along like a macabre decoration until the creature's gullet opened again, and she too disappeared into the darkness. Myra had frozen, her body refusing to obey her screaming mind's commands to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there and watch her friends die. She watched as Jessica, a woman she had shared an apartment with for 3 years, was scraped from the rock face by one of the creature's hooked appendages, the spur catching her under the chin and lifting her off her feet before slamming her against the stone with enough force to burst her like an overripe fruit. Blood sprayed in an arc that painted the granite red, and Myra tasted copper in her mouth, realizing she had bitten through her own lip in her terror. One by one, they died. Some were consumed outright, vanishing into the creature's maw with wet, crunching sounds that suggested the bolter's teeth were not merely for show. Others were crushed beneath its bulk, their bodies pulped by the sheer weight of the thing as it slid over them, leaving behind only smears of red on the stone that could have been mistaken for rust or mineral deposits by anyone who didn't know better. A few tried to fight, brandishing trekking poles and camp axes against the geological nightmare. But their blows bounced harmlessly off the creature's stony hide, and they died cursing, their final words lost in the grinding of stone on stone. Through it all, Myra stood motionless, her body locked in a paralysis that went beyond fear into something like transcendence. She watched the creature feed, watched it move with a horrible grace that seemed almost beautiful if you could forget the blood, and the screaming, and the way the sun caught the slime dripping from its jaws in rainbow patterns that mocked the devastation below. She watched until the last of her friends was gone, until the creature's maw closed with a sound like a crypt sealing shut, until the silence returned to the mountainside, broken only by the wet, satisfied sounds of digestion coming from somewhere deep within the beast's bulk. Then it had looked at her. Or rather, it had oriented toward her. The bolter had no eyes that Myra could see, only smooth expanses of stone-like hide that seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it. But she felt its attention, felt the weight of its awareness settle on her like a physical pressure that made her knees buckle and her vision tunnel. It knew she was there, knew she had witnessed its feeding, and for a long moment that stretched into eternity, Myra was certain she would be next. But the creature didn't strike. It simply hung there on the slope, its bulk somehow defying gravity, its hooks sunk deep into the granite, regarding her with whatever passed for sight in its alien anatomy. And then, slowly, almost deliberately, it turned away. It slid up the slope with a sound like grinding millstones, moving against gravity in ways that should have been impossible, its massive form rippling and flexing as it climbed back to the ridgeline from which it had emerged. Within minutes, it was gone, indistinguishable once again from the surrounding rock, leaving behind only the destruction and the blood and Myra, alone on the mountainside with the silence and the screams echoing in her head. She didn't remember walking down from the ridge. She didn't remember the 4 days it took her to reach civilization, her feet bleeding, her mind shattered, her mouth babbling about things with hooks that swallowed trails whole. She didn't remember the search and rescue team finding her collapsed on the side of a Forest Service road, speaking in tongues about mountains that hungered and stone that moved with intent. She didn't remember the hospital, the sedatives, the gentle questions that became less gentle as the days passed and no other survivors were found. What she remembered, what she would always remember, was the way the creature had looked at her before it turned away. There had been something in that wordless communication, something that went beyond predator and prey, beyond hunger and satisfaction. It had recognized something in her, Myra was certain of it. It had seen something that made her not worth eating, or perhaps too valuable to consume, or perhaps simply too broken to bother with. Whatever the reason, it had spared her, and that knowledge would haunt her for the rest of her life. Because she understood, in the part of her mind that still functioned rationally beneath the trauma, that the bolter had not been merciful. It had been patient. It had been playing with her, the way a cat plays with a mouse, letting her go so that it could hunt her again later when the sport would be better. She was marked now, chosen, and someday it would come for her when she least expected it, when she had begun to believe that the horror was behind her. The psychiatrists called it survivor's guilt. They said she was projecting her trauma onto the wilderness, creating a monster to embody her guilt at being the only one who lived. They said the rock slide had been a tragic accident, that her brain had constructed the bolter as a defense mechanism to avoid accepting the randomness of her friends' deaths. They said she would recover with time and therapy and the right combination of medications. Myra knew they were wrong. She had seen the thing with hooks. She had felt its attention, its patient hunger. And she knew, with a certainty that transcended logic or reason, that it was still out there, waiting in the high peaks where the air was thin and the wind carried the smell of ancient stone. It was waiting for her, or for others like her, for the foolish and the brave and the unlucky who strayed too far from the safety of civilization and into the domain of things that had ruled the earth long before humans learned to walk upright. The mountains were hungry and they would feed again. They had all the time in the world. Chadwick Pemberton III, who insisted on being called Chadwick, never Chad, as if the extra syllables added class to a name that had been handed down through 3 generations of nouveau rich real estate developers, stood at the edge of the precipice and felt, for the first time in his 23 years of privileged existence, something approaching genuine emotion. It wasn't fear exactly, though the 50-degree slope falling away beneath his designer hiking boots certainly warranted caution. It wasn't excitement, though his heart was pounding in a way that his personal trainer had assured him was excellent cardio. It was something more primal, more dangerous, a recognition that he was doing something real, something that couldn't be undone with a refund or a lawyer's letter, and the sensation was so novel that he almost laughed aloud. "Yo, Chadwick, you good, bro?" called Jason, his cameraman and erstwhile best friend from their fraternity days at USC. Jason was crouched 10 feet back from the edge, his own fear manifesting as excessive concern for Chadwick's well-being. "That ledge looks sketchy as hell, man. Maybe we should try the shot from somewhere else." But Chadwick wasn't listening. He was composing his opening monologue, running through the lines he had rehearsed in the mirror that morning, while his personal assistant applied concealer to the dark circles under his eyes. This was going to be the video that broke the internet, the content that would finally cement his status as more than just another rich kid playing at being an adventurer. The others, Kardashian, Paul, those D'Amelio brats, had built empires on less. They had never stood on a 50-degree slope in the Rocky Mountains, had never risked actual death for their art. When Chadwick posted this, when his followers saw him dangling over the abyss with nothing but courage and a GoPro between him and oblivion, they would understand that he was different. He was authentic. "Rolling in 3, 2, 1, Jason called out, his voice tight with anxiety. Chadwick turned to face the camera, his expression shifting instantly into the carefully calibrated blend of intensity and nonchalance that had earned him 2.3 million Instagram followers. "What's up, CP3 Army?" he began, using the nickname his fans had given themselves without a trace of irony. "Welcome back to the channel where we don't just push boundaries, we shatter them. Today, we're in the never-summer wilderness, and I'm about to do something that has literally never been done before." He gestured expansively at the panorama behind him, the jagged peaks rising like broken teeth against a sky so blue it seemed artificial. "Behind me is what locals call Devil's Throat, a slope so steep, so dangerous, that the Forest Service doesn't even maintain a trail here. They say it's impossible to climb. They say it's suicide to even try." He paused for effect, letting the camera drink in his wind-tousled hair and the determined set of his jaw. "But you know what I say. I say impossible is just a word the weak use to justify their fear." Behind the camera, Jason suppressed a groan. He had heard this speech, or variations of it, at least 24 times in the past year as Chadwick's stunts grew increasingly reckless. First, it had been base jumping from a hotel in Dubai, then swimming with sharks in South Africa without a cage. Then that idiotic free solo climb in Yosemite that had ended with Chadwick in the hospital with 2 broken ribs and a concussion. Each time, the videos had garnered millions of views. Each time the sponsorships had grown fatter and more prestigious. And each time Jason had felt a little more complicit in what was increasingly clearly a death wish wrapped in branding opportunities. "Cut," Jason said, lowering the camera. "That was good, Chadwick, really good. You want to do another take from a different angle." But Chadwick was already shaking his head, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. "No, man, something's wrong. Look at the ridge." Jason followed his gaze to the eastern ridgeline, where the granite spine that formed the backbone of this section of mountains rose against the sky. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just rock and snow, and the occasional stunted tree clinging to crevices where soil had accumulated over millennia. Then he noticed the movement. The entire ridgeline seemed to be twitching, a subtle vibration that made the snow on the upper slopes shiver and slide in small avalanches that puffed white into the still air. "Is that an earthquake?" Jason asked, his voice rising an octave. "I don't think," Chadwick began, but the words died in his throat as the ridge moved. It didn't crumble, it didn't slide, it flexed. The solid granite, which had stood unmoving since the Precambrian era, suddenly bent like a muscle contracting, and in that moment of impossible movement, the bolter revealed itself. The creature had been dormant, its body compressed and flattened against the slope in a state of hibernation that made it indistinguishable from the surrounding stone. Now it woke, and the mountain itself seemed to scream. The sound was tectonic, primordial, the grinding of continental plates colliding compressed into a single deafening roar. The bolter's maw opened like a fissure in the earth, revealing rows of crystalline teeth that caught the sunlight and threw it back in fractured, blood-colored shards. The creature's bulk detached from the ridgeline with a sound like ripping fabric amplified to the volume of thunder, and it began to slide. Not fall. Slide. The bolter moved with a horrible grace, its underside somehow gripping the stone as it descended the 50-degree slope with the momentum of an avalanche but the precision of a predator. Its hooks, massive curved projections that emerged from its ventral surface like the talons of some impossible bird of prey, dug into the granite with showers of sparks, controlling its descent, angling its trajectory toward the two frozen men on the ledge. "Run!" Jason screamed, but the word was lost in the cacophony of grinding stone and his own terror. He stumbled backward away from the ledge, away from Chadwick, his camera falling from numb fingers and bouncing once, twice, before disappearing over the edge into the abyss. He didn't notice. His entire consciousness had collapsed into a single imperative: survive. Chadwick didn't run. He couldn't. His body had locked up, his muscles paralyzed by the same disbelief that had claimed Ranger McCall months earlier. This couldn't be happening. This was impossible. Things like this didn't exist in the real world, in the world of sponsorships and analytics and brand partnerships. This was horror movie stuff, campfire story stuff, the kind of thing that happened to other people, to poor people, to people who didn't have the sense to hire good lawyers and buy proper insurance. The bolter was on him in seconds, its massive bulk filling his vision until there was nothing else. No sky, no mountains, no future, just the endless dark of its throat and the crystalline teeth that lined its maw like the entrance to hell itself. Chadwick had time to scream, time to raise his arms in a pathetic gesture of defense, time to regret every decision that had led him to this moment of absolute annihilation. The teeth closed around his waist with a sound like wet gravel crunching underfoot. Chadwick's scream became a gurgle as the pressure of the bolter's bite compressed his torso, driving the air from his lungs and cracking his ribs like dry twigs. He felt his spine snap, felt his internal organs rupture and burst under the impossible pressure. But somehow, impossibly, he remained conscious as the creature's maw opened wider and the darkness swallowed him whole. He didn't die immediately. The bolter's teeth were designed to incapacitate rather than kill outright, preserving the prey in a state of half-life while it traveled through the creature's digestive system. Chadwick felt himself sliding down a throat lined with mucus that burned like acid, felt the muscular contractions that propelled him deeper into the darkness. He tried to scream, but there was no air, only the hot, wet pressure of the creature's gullet crushing him from all sides. He felt other things in the darkness with him, soft masses that might have been the remains of the ranger station's occupant, or deer, or other unlucky creatures who had strayed too close to the bolter's hunting grounds. The smell was indescribable, a fetid miasma of decay and digestive juices that made his eyes water and his stomach heave, though there was no room to vomit, no space to do anything but endure. Then he reached the gizzard, and the real horror began. The bolter's digestive chamber was a cathedral of stone and flesh, a vast space lined with boulders that the creature had swallowed over centuries to aid in grinding its food. As Chadwick tumbled into the space, already broken and bleeding, the muscular walls began to contract, rolling the boulders in a slow, inexorable motion that crushed everything in their path. Chadwick saw them coming, saw the massive stones rolling toward him like the gears of some hellish mill, and he finally understood what the ranger had tried to warn them about, understood why the Forest Service had closed these trails, understood that his authenticity had purchased him a front-row seat to the most agonizing death imaginable. The first boulder rolled over his legs, crushing them to pulp. The second took his arms. The third, his chest. By the time the grinding stopped, Chadwick Pemberton III was no longer a person but a smear of organic matter being slowly absorbed through the creature's intestinal walls, his consciousness mercifully extinguished somewhere between the second and third crushing. Outside on the slope, Jason was running for his life. He had made it 50 yards, his lungs burning, his legs pumping with adrenaline-fueled desperation, when he felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The bolter, having consumed Chadwick in 3 quick bites, had reoriented and was coming for him. Jason didn't look back. He knew what he would see, knew that the creature was sliding down the slope with terrifying speed, its hooks tearing furrows in the stone that sent up showers of sparks. He reached a cluster of stunted pines and threw himself into their meager cover, hoping against hope that the trees might slow the creature down, might buy him enough time to find a crevice, a cave, anything that might hide him from the geological nightmare that had already claimed his friend. But the bolter didn't slow. Its bulk slammed into the trees with the force of a freight train, snapping trunks like matchsticks, sending wood splinters flying like shrapnel. Jason felt something pierce his shoulder, a shard of pine that drove deep into the muscle and made him cry out in pain, but he kept running, kept moving, because stopping meant dying. The creature's fluke tail caught him as he cleared the tree line. The impact lifted him off his feet and threw him 30 feet through the air, his body rag-dolling in a way that made it clear his back had broken. He landed on a patch of scree, the loose stones sliding beneath him, carrying him down the slope in a mini avalanche of his own. He tried to scream, but his lungs weren't working properly, his broken spine interfering with the nerves that controlled his breathing. He lay there, paralyzed and helpless, watching as the bolter turned with terrible grace and began to slide toward him, its maw opening to reveal the crystalline teeth that glistened with Chadwick's blood. It didn't eat him immediately. The bolter was a patient predator, and Jason was already incapacitated, already dying. The creature settled its bulk around him, its hooks digging into the stone on either side of his broken body, pinning him in place. It would wait, the bolter knew, wait for the prey to die so that the meal would be easier to digest. Jason felt the warmth of his own blood pooling beneath him, felt the cold of the mountain seeping into his bones, felt the creature's patient hunger radiating from the stony mass that surrounded him like a wall of living granite. He died slowly, over the course of several hours, his body going into shock, his mind mercifully shutting down as hypothermia and blood loss combined to end his suffering. The bolter waited, its massive form draped over him like a shroud, its gizzard working steadily on the remains of Chadwick Pemberton III. When Jason finally stopped breathing, when his heart stuttered and failed, the creature simply opened its maw and swallowed him whole, adding him to the slurry of meat and bone that was slowly being transformed into nutrients. The camera that had fallen from Jason's hand continued recording until its battery died. The footage, when it was eventually found by a search and rescue team 3 weeks later, would be classified and buried so deeply that even Freedom of Information requests couldn't unearth it. But rumors persisted, whispers about a video that showed impossible things, a creature of stone and hunger that moved like an avalanche and consumed like a nightmare. The footage would become legend, passed from hand to hand on dark web forums, debated by cryptozoologists and dismissed by scientists, but never explained. Because some things once seen cannot be unseen, and some hungers once awakened can never be satisfied. The bolter slept again, its belly full, its dreams slow and stony and patient. The mountains had fed and they would feed again. They had all the time in the world. Elias Vance had lived in the shadow of the Never-Summer Mountains for 72 years, and in that time he had learned that the wilderness did not suffer fools gladly. He had survived blizzards that had frozen lesser men solid, fought off grizzlies with nothing but a skinning knife, and once walked 40 miles on a broken leg after a hunting accident left him stranded in the high country for 2 weeks. He had seen things in those mountains that would turn a city man's hair white: ghost lights dancing on the snow, phantom herds of elk that vanished when approached, the bones of creatures that had no names in any taxonomy book. But he had never spoken of these things, not to the anthropologists who came prying into local legends, not to the documentary filmmakers who wanted to capture the authentic mountain experience, and certainly not to the park rangers who had spent the last 3 decades trying to convince him to move into town like a civilized person. He lived in a cabin that had been built by his great-grandfather in 1887, a rough-hewn structure of logs and stone that clung to the mountainside like a lichen, weathered by a century of storms and snows into something that seemed to have grown organically from the rock itself. There was no electricity, no running water, no cell service for 50 miles in any direction. Elias heated the place with a wood stove, lit it with oil lamps, and ate whatever he could trap or shoot or grow in the small garden plot that clung to the one patch of relatively flat ground his family had managed to clear over generations. He had heard about the disappearances, of course. Even a hermit couldn't remain entirely ignorant of the world, and Elias made a monthly trek down to the nearest town to trade pelts for salt and coffee, and the few other necessities he couldn't produce himself. He heard the gossip in the general store, saw the posters with the faces of the missing, listened to the sheriff's theories about avalanches and rockslides and the dangers of backcountry hiking. He said nothing, offered no opinions, kept his weathered face carefully neutral as he bartered his furs and accepted his supplies. But he knew, he had always known. The night the girl came to his door, he was sitting by the stove reading a tattered copy of Robinson Crusoe by the flickering light of an oil lamp. The knock startled him. Visitors were unheard of at this elevation, especially after dark, and he reached for the 30-30 that hung above the door before remembering that no human had ever found his cabin without a guide, and no guide would bring anyone here after sunset. The girl on his porch was barely recognizable as human. Her clothes were rags, her feet bare and bloody, her face a mask of dried tears and snot and something else, something that looked like madness. She was muttering to herself, a stream of words that made no sense, about hooks and teeth and mountains that moved with intent. Elias knew her type. He had seen them before, the survivors, the ones who got away by pure luck or the creature's whims. They never lasted long after, most of them. The sanity they lost in the encounter rarely returned, and those who kept their minds usually ended up taking their own lives within a year, unable to live with the knowledge of what they had seen. This one, he could tell already, was broken beyond repair. Her eyes were the eyes of a deer caught in a trap, wide and wild, and full of the knowledge of impending death. "You saw it," he said. "It wasn't a question." The girl Myra, she said her name was, though the word came out as a whisper barely audible over the wind, nodded, and fresh tears began to flow down her cheeks. "It took them all," she managed, the words coming in bursts between sobs. 12 of them. My friends. She broke down completely, collapsing against the doorframe, her body racked with grief that seemed to go beyond the loss of her companions into some deeper, more primal horror. Elias helped her inside, built up the fire, wrapped her in a bearskin blanket that had been his father's. He brewed tea from wild herbs that grew on the slopes above his cabin, plants that had mild sedative properties, and forced her to drink. Slowly, haltingly, the story came out. The hiking trip. The ridge. The creature that moved like an avalanche and consumed like a nightmare. She spoke of crystalline teeth and hooks that dug into stone, of a gullet that swallowed grown adults whole, of the way the creature had looked at her before turning away, sparing her for reasons she couldn't understand. When she finished, Elias sat in silence for a long time, staring into the fire. "Leviathan's land shark," he said finally, his voice raspy from disuse. "That's what my great-grandfather called it, what all the old-timers called it back when these mountains were still being settled." Myra looked at him, her eyes clearing slightly as curiosity cut through the haze of trauma. "You know what it is." "I know what it does," Elias corrected. "I don't know what it is. No one does. My great-grandfather thought it was something that lived in the earth, something that came up from below when it got hungry. His father thought it was punishment from God for the sins of the mining camps. The Ute who lived here before us had stories about a stone spirit that ate men who disrespected the mountains." He shrugged, a gesture that conveyed both ignorance and acceptance. "Names don't matter. What matters is that it's real and it's hungry, and it has been since long before humans walked these peaks." He told her the history then, the stories passed down through his family for 5 generations. How the 19th century miners had first encountered the creature when they began tunneling into the mountains for silver and gold. How it had emerged from a shaft one winter's night and consumed an entire crew of 20 men before the survivors managed to seal the tunnel with dynamite. How the mining company had covered it up, called it a cave-in, paid off the families and moved operations to a different mountain. But the creature hadn't stayed sealed. It had found other ways out, other vents and fissures, and it had begun hunting the surface with increasing frequency. "The miners got clever," Elias continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller recounting ancient history. "They figured out that it could be not satisfied exactly but distracted. They started feeding it. Prisoners at first, men the company wanted to get rid of anyway, then convicts from the territorial prison, then anyone who wouldn't be missed. They'd chain them up in the high valleys, leave them as offerings. The creature would take them, and for a while it would leave the mines alone." Myra stared at him in horror. "They sacrificed people to it." "They survived," Elias said simply. "For 30 years the bolter, that's what they called it because of the way it moves, sliding down slopes like a rock slide, the bolter left the mines alone as long as it got its tribute. Then the silver played out, the mines closed, and the feeding stopped. The creature went hungry for decades, sleeping mostly, waking only occasionally when some unlucky soul stumbled into its territory. It was patient. It could wait." "Until now," Myra whispered. "Until now," Elias agreed. "Tourism brought people back into these mountains. Backpackers, climbers, that idiot social media crowd who think nature is just a backdrop for their vanity. The bolter's been waking up more often, feeding more frequently. It's growing bold, growing fat. Used to be you could avoid it if you knew where not to go, which slopes to avoid. Now it's hunting actively, herding prey, playing with its food." He looked at her with eyes that had seen too much. "The way it looked at you before it let you go, that wasn't mercy, girl, that was marking you. It knows your scent now. It'll find you again when it's ready." Myra felt cold despite the warmth of the fire, felt the creature's attention settle on her memory like a physical weight. "Is there a way to kill it?" Elias laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Kill it? You might as well ask how to kill a mountain. It's stone and hunger and patience, girl. It doesn't die, it waits. But there are ways to," he paused, considering. "There are ways to discourage it, ways to make it look for easier prey. The miners had tricks, old methods that sometimes worked. Decoys, traps, things to confuse it or drive it off." He stood and went to a chest in the corner of the cabin, rummaging through it until he found what he was looking for. A leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, covered in handwriting that spanned 5 generations. "My great-grandfather's notes," he said, handing it to her. "Everything he learned about the bolter. The patterns of its movement, the places it likes to hunt, the methods that sometimes work to keep it at bay. Take it. You're going to need it more than I do." "Why are you helping me?" Myra asked, clutching the journal to her chest. Elias looked at her, and for a moment his weathered face softened into something like pity. "Because you're marked, girl. Because it's coming for you eventually, and when it does, you deserve a fighting chance. And because," he hesitated, then shrugged, Because I've lived my whole life in fear of that thing and I'm tired of being afraid. Maybe it's time someone tried to fight back." They made their plans that night, sitting by the fire until the oil lamps burned low. Elias would guide Myra down to the nearest town, get her to the authorities, try to make them understand the danger that was growing in the mountains. It was a fool's errand, he knew that, but he had to try. And Myra would use the journal, learn what she could about the creature that had taken her friends, try to find a weakness, a way to destroy it or at least drive it back into the deep places where it had slept for so long. They left at dawn, making their way down the mountain in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. They didn't see the bolter, didn't hear its passage, but they both felt its attention, felt the weight of its awareness following them from the high peaks. It was watching, waiting, patient as the stone it resembled. The mountains were hungry and they would feed again. They had all the time in the world. Ranger Captain Samuel Holt had spent 20 years with the Forest Service, and in that time he had learned that bureaucracy moved slowly but inevitably, crushing initiative and innovation under the weight of procedure and protocol. When he first heard the rumors about the bolter, the whispers among the old-timers, the classified footage from the influencer's camera, the rambling testimony of the survivor they had found in the high country, he had tried to take action. He had written reports, requested resources, proposed an evacuation of the affected areas until the threat could be assessed and neutralized. His superiors had thanked him for his concern and filed his reports in the appropriate circular receptacle. But Holt was not a man to be deterred by bureaucracy. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, had led his platoon through ambushes and IED attacks, had learned that sometimes you had to take matters into your own hands when the chain of command failed you. The bolter was real. He had seen the footage, had watched the creature emerge from the mountainside like a nightmare given physical form, had seen it consume 2 men in seconds and leave nothing behind but blood on the stone. He had interviewed Myra Takeda, had listened to her describe the creature's behavior, its patterns, its apparent weaknesses, and he had made his decision. He gathered a team of volunteers, men and women who had seen the footage, who believed, who were willing to risk their careers and their lives to stop the slaughter before it escalated further. They were rangers mostly, with a few local hunters and that crazy old trapper who lived in the hills. Vance had come to him, had offered his family's knowledge, the techniques that had worked, sometimes, to control the creature in the past. Holt had been skeptical at first, but desperation made him open to unconventional solutions. The plan was simple: bait and trap. They would construct a dummy, a mannequin dressed in ranger gear, rigged with explosives and scent markers designed to attract the bolter, and place it in one of the creature's known hunting grounds. When the bolter struck, they would trigger the explosives, hoping to injure or at least drive off the creature. It was a long shot, Holt knew, but it was better than doing nothing while people died. They set up in a high valley that Vance identified as a likely hunting ground, a narrow defile between 2 ridges that formed a natural choke point. The dummy was positioned on a ledge overlooking the valley, visible from the slopes above where the bolter typically hunted. Explosives were planted at strategic points throughout the valley, enough to bring down tons of rock and hopefully bury the creature, or at least injure it badly enough to drive it away. Holt positioned his team in camouflaged blinds along the valley walls, each armed with high-powered rifles and grenade launchers loaded with incendiary rounds. They weren't expecting to kill the creature with small arms. Vance had made it clear that conventional weapons were useless against the bolter's stony hide, but the fire might discourage it, might buy them time to trigger the main trap. They waited for 3 days. The weather was clear, the visibility perfect, and Holt began to wonder if they had chosen the wrong location, if the creature had moved on to other hunting grounds. Then, on the 3rd night, the temperature dropped suddenly, and the stars were obscured by a haze that seemed to emanate from the mountains themselves. Holt was dozing in his blind when the radio crackled with a whispered warning from the lookout on the eastern ridge. Movement. Ridge line. It's Christ, it's huge. He snapped awake, raising his binoculars to scan the slope above the valley. At first, he saw nothing, just the jagged silhouette of the ridge against the star-scattered sky. Then the ridge moved, and he understood why the old trapper had called it a land shark. The creature didn't just slide down the slope. It flowed, its massive bulk somehow maintaining cohesion as it descended with the momentum of an avalanche. The hooks on its underside, massive curved projections that Vance had described but that Holt hadn't truly believed until he saw them, dug into the stone with showers of sparks, controlling its descent. "Hold positions," Holt whispered into the radio. "Wait for it to take the bait." But the bolter didn't take the bait. It slid past the dummy without slowing, its bulk passing within 50 feet of the mannequin without so much as a twitch of interest. Holt watched in confusion as the creature continued down the slope, angling not toward the decoy but toward the valley floor where his team was hidden. "It's not working," he whispered. "It's ignoring the decoy." Vance's voice came over the radio, cracked with age and fear. "It knows. It learns, Captain. It's been fed decoys before, it remembers." The realization hit Holt like a physical blow. The creature wasn't just a dumb beast. It was intelligent, adaptable, capable of learning from experience. They had played their hand too early, shown it their strategy, and now it was turning the tables. The bolter struck the valley floor with a sound like thunder, its bulk sending up a cloud of dust and debris that obscured the moonlight. Holt could hear screaming from the other blinds, heard the rattle of gunfire as his team opened up on the creature, but he knew it was useless even before he saw the sparks bouncing off the bolter's stony hide. The bullets weren't even scratching it. "Fall back," he screamed into the radio. "All units fall back to secondary positions." But it was too late. The bolter had already identified the locations of the blinds, had somehow sensed the heat signatures or the vibrations of human presence. Its hooks lashed out, tearing through the camouflaged structures like paper, impaling the rangers inside and dragging them screaming into the open. Holt watched in horror as one of his men, a young woman named Chen who had just transferred from the Yellowstone district, was caught by a hook that drove through her chest and lifted her off her feet. The creature dragged her up the slope, her screams becoming gurgles as her ribs cracked and her lungs filled with blood, and then its maw opened and she was gone, consumed in a single gulp. Another ranger, a veteran named Rodriguez, tried to make a stand, emptying his magazine into the creature's flank before the fluke tail caught him and slammed him against the valley wall with enough force to crush his skull like an overripe melon. His body slid down the stone, leaving a smear of red that looked black in the moonlight, and the bolter turned to find its next victim. Holt was running now, abandoning his position, his weapon, his duty, everything in the face of an enemy that could not be fought with courage or tactics. He scrambled up the valley wall, his fingers finding purchase on cracks and ledges, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he climbed for his life. Behind him, he could hear the wet sounds of the creature feeding, the screams of his team fading one by one as the bolter worked its way through them with methodical efficiency. He reached a narrow ledge and pressed himself against the stone, trying to make himself small, invisible, hoping against hope that the creature would be satisfied with the rangers it had already taken and wouldn't notice one more human scrambling up the rock face. He held his breath, listening to the silence that had fallen over the valley, broken only by the wet, grinding sounds of digestion. Then he felt it, the attention of the creature, that palpable weight that Vance had described, settling on him like a physical pressure. He didn't move, didn't breathe, prayed to a god he had stopped believing in years ago that the old trapper's theories were right, that the bolter hunted by movement, that stillness might save him. The creature slid closer, its bulk scraping against the stone inches from his hiding place. Holt could smell it now, the stench of sulfur and ancient decay, the hot metal smell of the hooks scoring the granite. He could hear its breathing, a slow, bellows-like sound that stirred the dust at his feet. It knew he was there. It had to know. but it wasn't striking, wasn't opening its maw to swallow him whole. For a long moment, seconds that stretched into eternities, they remained frozen, predator and prey locked in a standoff that neither understood. Then, slowly, the pressure lifted. The creature slid away, moving up the valley toward the next group of rangers, leaving Holt trembling and alive on his narrow ledge. He didn't understand why it had spared him until he remembered Vance's words. "It's playing with us, it's smart, it learns." The bolter had let him live because it wanted him to survive, wanted him to carry the tale of what had happened here back to the world of men. It was a message, a declaration of power. The mountains were hungry, and they would not be denied. Holt waited until dawn, until the creature had finished feeding and retreated to the high peaks, before climbing down to survey the devastation. Of his team of 12, only 3 remained alive, all of them catatonic, their minds broken by what they had witnessed. The rest were gone, consumed or crushed, their bodies added to the bolter's grist for the mill. He found Vance's body near the center of the valley, impaled on a hook and dragged halfway up the slope before being dropped. The old trapper's eyes were open, staring at the sky, and in his hand he clutched a leather journal, the one he had given to Myra. Holt realized. She must have returned it, must have come back despite the danger, and Vance had died protecting whatever knowledge it contained. Holt took the journal and walked down the mountain, his career in ruins, his sanity hanging by a thread, but alive. Alive to warn others, to try to make the authorities understand what they were facing. Alive to carry the message that the mountains were no longer safe, that the wilderness had developed a taste for human flesh, that the ancient hungers of the earth were waking once more. The bolter slept in its high peaks, its belly full, its dreams slow and stony and patient. It had fed well this night, and it would feed again. The mountains had tasted blood, and they would not be denied. They had all the time in the world. The survivors of the failed counterattack had been evacuated, the area declared off-limits, the official explanation chalked up to a tragic training accident involving explosives. But the truth, as always, was more complicated and far more terrible. The bolter was still out there, still hunting, and its behavior was changing in ways that suggested intelligence, strategy, a level of cognition that went beyond simple animal instinct. It had learned from the failed trap, had studied the human's methods and adapted its own tactics accordingly. Where it had once hunted passively, waiting for prey to wander into its territory, now it was actively herding, driving victims toward specific locations where escape was impossible and the killing could be done at its leisure. Myra had seen it first, during the weeks she spent recovering in the psychiatric facility, poring over Vance's journal during the sleepless nights when the sedatives failed to quiet her mind. She had read the accounts of the 19th century miners, the patterns they had observed in the creature's behavior, the ways it had manipulated its environment to maximize its hunting success. The bolter didn't just consume, it cultivated. It maintained populations of prey animals in specific areas, driving off predators that might compete with it, clearing paths that allowed for easier access to the hunting grounds. It was less a random predator than a shepherd of flesh, and humans had become its favorite livestock. The first sign of the new hunting pattern came 3 weeks after the failed counterattack. A group of 6 experienced backpackers, men and women who had hiked these mountains for decades, who knew the terrain and the dangers and how to avoid them, disappeared from a section of trail that had been considered safe, far from the bolter's known hunting grounds. Search teams found their campsite undisturbed, their gear still packed, as if they had simply walked away and never returned. It was Myra who figured out what had happened. She had been released from the facility by then, deemed stable enough to function in society despite the nightmares that still plagued her sleep. She had gone back to the mountains, against the advice of her doctors and the explicit orders of the Forest Service, driven by a need to understand, to find a way to stop the creature before it could claim more victims. She found the signs along the trail, the broken branches, the displaced stones, the subtle markers that suggested something large had moved through the area with purpose. The bolter had knocked down trees, she realized, had created barriers that forced the hikers onto a narrow ledge where escape was impossible. Then it had waited, patient as the stone it resembled, until the humans had nowhere else to go. She found the bodies, or what was left of them, in a box canyon 3 miles from the trail. The bolter had played with them, had herded them like cattle, had taken its time with the killing. The remains were scattered across the canyon floor, some partially consumed, others crushed beyond recognition. One body, a man in his 40s who had tried to outrun the creature according to the position of his remains, had slid into the bolter's waiting throat after the creature knocked loose a boulder that sent him tumbling down the slope. His legs had still been kicking when the teeth closed around him, still visible as the creature's maw swallowed him whole. Another victim, a woman who had been the first to die according to the blood spatter patterns, had been bisected by a snapped spruce trunk that the bolter had flung like a javelin, using the momentum of its passing. The tree had caught her at waist height, cutting her cleanly in two, her upper body landing 10 feet away from her legs. She had lived for several seconds after the impact, long enough to watch her own intestines spill onto the stone, long enough to scream before the blood loss claimed her consciousness. Myra documented everything, taking photographs that she knew would be dismissed as fakes, collecting samples that would be explained away as natural phenomena. She was beyond caring about credibility now, beyond worrying about whether anyone would believe her. What mattered was understanding the creature, finding a pattern, a weakness, anything that could be used against it. The journal had mentioned something, a reference in Vance's great-grandfather's handwriting to the bolter's apparent blindness to immobile prey. The miners had noticed it first, had observed that men who froze completely, who didn't move even when the creature was inches away, sometimes survived encounters that killed those who ran or fought. The theory was that the bolter hunted by vibration, by the movement of air and the shifting of stone, and that absolute stillness made a human invisible to its senses. Myra tested the theory, risking her life in ways that would have gotten her committed again if anyone had known. She found the bolter's hunting grounds, positioned herself in its path, and forced herself to remain absolutely motionless as the creature slid past her, close enough to touch, close enough to smell the sulfur on its breath. It worked. The creature passed within 10 feet of her hiding place without slowing, its bulk rippling past like a geological event given malicious intent. But she also discovered something else, something the journal hadn't mentioned. The bolter's blindness to stillness wasn't absolute. It was a preference, a hunting strategy, not a physical limitation. If the creature was hungry enough, if the prey was tempting enough, it would strike at motionless targets as readily as moving ones. And it was learning, adapting, becoming less reliant on the vibration sense as it gained experience hunting humans. Worse, the local wildlife had figured out the bolter's weakness as well. Myra observed wolves, driven desperate by the depletion of their normal prey, using the same strategy she had employed. They would find human hikers, maul them just enough to incapacitate them, then retreat to safety. The injured humans, unable to move, would lie still out of fear or pain, and the bolter would pass them by, at least until the wolves grew bold enough to attack the humans in earnest, drawing the creature's attention and creating a diversion that allowed the pack to escape. Nature had turned cannibal, the predators feeding on each other, humans caught in the middle of an ancient war that had nothing to do with them. Myra watched a pack of wolves take down a hiker on the edge of the bolter's territory, tearing at his legs until he couldn't run, then retreating as the creature slid down the slope toward the scent of blood. The man had lain still, playing dead, and the bolter had paused, confused by the lack of movement. But then one of the wolves, overconfident or simply hungry, had returned to finish the kill, and the bolter had struck, its hooks impaling both wolf and human in a single blow, dragging them both into its maw while the rest of the pack fled. It was a nightmare ecosystem, A food chain turned upside down, with humans at the bottom and the bolter at the top, but with all the old rules suspended. The creatures of the forest, driven to desperation by the bolter's dominance, had learned to use humans as bait, as distractions, as shields against the greater predator. And the humans, caught between the wolves and the stone shark, had no defense against either. Myra knew she had to find a way to stop it, to end the cycle before the entire region became uninhabitable, a dead zone where nothing lived and nothing dared to enter. She pored over the journal, looking for something, anything that might give her an edge. And in the oldest entries in the cramped handwriting of Vance's great-great-grandfather, she found it, a reference to the mining company's final solution, the method they had used to seal the bolter in its tunnel all those years ago. Dynamite, massive quantities of dynamite enough to bring down an entire mountainside. The miners had tried to kill it, had buried it under tons of rock in a desperate attempt to end the nightmare. They had failed, the creature had eventually found its way out, but the attempt had driven it into dormancy for decades, had bought the region years of peace. Perhaps, Myra thought, it could work again. Perhaps the creature could be injured, weakened, driven back into the deep places where it had slept for so long. She began a plan to prepare, to gather the resources she would need for one final confrontation. The bolter was hunting more frequently now, growing bolder, growing fat on the steady stream of victims that tourism brought into its territory. It was only a matter of time before the creature expanded its range, before the disappearances became too numerous to ignore, before the authorities were forced to acknowledge the truth. Myra intended to stop it before that happened, to end the creature's reign of terror or die trying. She had survived one encounter with the bolter through luck and cowardice. She would not survive a second unless she was prepared, unless she had a plan, unless she could find a way to turn the creature's own strength against it. The mountains were hungry and they were growing bolder, but Myra Takeda was done running. She had seen what the bolter did to those it consumed, had heard the screams of her friends echoing in her dreams every night for months. She would end this, one way or another, even if it meant joining her friends in the darkness of the creature's gullet. The bolter slept in its high peaks, dreaming stony dreams of blood and consumption. It didn't know that the prey was planning, preparing, plotting its destruction. It didn't know that the game was about to change, that the hunted was about to become the hunter. The mountains had fed, but they would feed again, unless Myra could find a way to stop them. Unless she could find a way to kill a mountain. The canyon was perfect. Myra had spent weeks scouting locations, hiking through terrain that had become familiar in the way that nightmares become familiar, intimate, personal, etched into the memory by trauma and repetition. She knew these mountains now, knew their moods and their secrets, knew the places where the bolter hunted and the paths it preferred to travel. And she had found this place, this narrow gorge where the walls rose sheer on either side, where the floor was flat and the exits were limited, where even a creature of stone and hunger might be trapped. It had taken her months to prepare, months of working in secret, stealing explosives from construction sites and mining operations, recruiting a small team of believers who had seen enough to know that the official explanations were lies. There were more of them than she had expected, rangers who had found impossible remains, search and rescue volunteers who had seen things they couldn't explain, locals who had lost family members to the mountain's hunger and wanted answers. They worked at night, under cover of darkness, carrying supplies up the canyon under the watchful gaze of stars that seemed to judge their folly. The trap was elaborate, a testament to desperation and ingenuity. Explosive charges were set at key points along the canyon walls, rigged to bring down thousands of tons of rock in a controlled collapse that would bury the bolter under a mountain of its own element. The detonators were connected to a central trigger that Myra would control from a position high above the canyon, a ledge that offered a clear view of the killing ground and, hopefully, protection from the creature's reach. The bait was the hardest part. The bolter wouldn't enter the canyon unless there was prey to draw it in, prey that moved, that struggled, that offered the promise of fresh meat. Myra had agonized over the solution, had nearly abandoned the plan rather than face the moral abyss it required. But in the end, necessity forced her hand. She captured a wolf, a young male from the pack that had been using humans as bolter bait, and kept it caged in the canyon for 3 days before the operation. The creature was hungry, desperate, its whines and struggles providing exactly the kind of vibration and movement that attracted the bolter's attention. It was cruel, Myra knew. The wolf would die, probably painfully, consumed by the creature or crushed by the rock slide. But it was one life against dozens, hundreds perhaps if the bolter continued to grow bolder. It was a necessary evil, a sin that she would carry to her grave, but one that might save countless others. The team gathered at dawn on the day of the operation, 12 men and women who had committed to seeing this through whatever the cost. They checked the explosives one last time, verified the wiring, confirmed that the detonation sequence would work as planned. Then they retreated to their positions, leaving Myra alone on her ledge with the trigger in her hands and the wolf below, pacing and whining in its cage. They didn't have to wait long. The bolter had been hunting in the region for weeks, its appetite growing with each feeding, its boldness increasing as it realized that the humans posed no real threat. The vibrations of the wolf's distress carried through the stone, audible to whatever senses the creature used to locate its prey, and within an hour of the sun clearing the eastern peaks, the ridgeline above the canyon began to tremble. Myra saw it first, the movement along the crest that signaled the creature's approach. The bolter was visible today, not bothering to camouflage itself among the stone, its massive bulk rippling as it slid down the slope toward the canyon entrance. It was larger than she remembered, grown fat on the steady diet of hikers and hunters, its stony hide covered in scars and mineral deposits that suggested centuries of existence. The hooks on its underside scored the granite with showers of sparks, and its maw hung open, dripping that opalescent slime that caught the morning light and refracted it into rainbow patterns. The creature paused at the canyon entrance, sensing something wrong, some trap in the making. For a long moment that stretched into eternity, Myra was certain it would turn away, that their plan would fail before it even began. Then the wolf howled, a sound of pure animal terror that echoed off the canyon walls, and the bolter's hesitation vanished. It surged forward, sliding into the canyon with terrifying speed, its bulk filling the narrow space from wall to wall. Now, Myra screamed, though her voice was unnecessary. The others couldn't hear her, were waiting for her signal. She pressed the trigger. The explosion was deafening, a wall of sound that hammered against her chest and made her ears ring. She saw the canyon walls shudder, saw cracks spiderweb across the stone, saw the charges detonate in sequence as tons of rock began to fall. Dust filled the air, obscuring her vision, turning the canyon into a swirling maelstrom of debris and noise. The bolter screamed. It was a sound like nothing Myra had ever heard, a tectonic shriek that made the stone itself vibrate. She felt it in her bones, in her teeth, in the marrow of her spine, a frequency that threatened to shake her apart from the inside. The creature thrashed in the canyon, its bulk twisting and writhing as the rock slide buried it, its hooks lashing out at the falling stone in futile attempts to deflect the avalanche. For a moment Myra allowed herself to hope. The creature was pinned, trapped under tons of rock, its movements growing sluggish as the debris piled higher. The dust began to settle, and she could see the shape of the bolter beneath the rubble, a massive bulge in the stone that twitched and heaved but couldn't break free. They had done it. They had trapped the beast, buried it under its own element, maybe even killed it. Then the bulge began to move. Not thrashing now, not panic struggling, but something else, something deliberate. The rock covering the creature began to shift, to crack, to fall away in chunks that revealed not the stony hide she expected, but something else, something wrong. The bolter's skin was peeling, flaking away in sheets that crumbled to dust as they fell, revealing what lay beneath. It wasn't dying, it was molting. The creature's outer layer, the camouflage of stone and mineral that had made it indistinguishable from the mountain, was simply a shell, a carapace that had grown too tight, too constraining. The explosion had damaged it, cracked it, and now the bolter was shedding it like a snake shedding its skin. Beneath the stone lay flesh, if it could be called flesh. It was gray and mottled, covered in weeping sores and pulsating veins that carried fluids the color of old motor oil. The texture was like nothing Myra had ever seen, part flesh and part fungus, and part something that defied categorization, something that belonged in the deep places where sunlight never reached. The creature's true body was smaller than its armored shell had suggested, perhaps only 200 feet from fluke to maw, but it was faster, more flexible, unencumbered by the weight of stone. It tore free of the rubble with a sound like ripping fabric, its new skin glistening wetly in the morning light, and it turned its attention to the ledge where Myra stood frozen. It had eyes now, or something like eyes, lidless orbs that emerged from the weeping flesh of its body, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, covering its surface in a pattern that suggested nothing so much as the compound eyes of an insect. They focused on her with terrible intelligence, and Myra understood in that moment that the creature had known about the trap all along, had entered the canyon not because it was fooled, but because it was curious, because it wanted to see what the humans would try, because it was bored and wanted entertainment. The new bolter was worse than the old. The stone shell had been armor, protection, but it had also been restraint, limiting the creature's true potential. Now it was free, unencumbered, and it moved with a speed that made its previous descent seem glacial by comparison. It flowed up the canyon wall, its hooks finding purchase on cracks and ledges that shouldn't have supported its weight, climbing toward Myra's position with terrifying agility. She ran. There was no thought, no plan, just the pure animal imperative to survive. She scrambled up the slope behind her, away from the canyon, away from the creature, her lungs burning and her legs pumping with adrenaline-fueled desperation. Behind her, she could hear the wet sounds of the bolter's passage, could smell the stench of its new body, could feel the heat radiating from its exposed flesh. The others were running too, she realized, their positions on the canyon rim abandoned as the creature emerged from its tomb and proved itself invincible. They scattered across the mountainside, a dozen humans fleeing in a dozen directions, and the bolter paused at the canyon's edge, surveying its options like a predator deciding which prey to pursue first. It chose Myra. Of course it did. It had marked her months ago, had recognized something in her that made her special, interesting, worthy of extended attention. It had let her live once, played with her, and now it was done playing. Now it was time to finish the game. She ran until her lungs were fire and her legs were rubber, until the world narrowed to the pain in her chest and the need to keep moving. She didn't look back, couldn't look back, because looking back meant seeing the creature that was closing the distance between them with impossible speed. She crested a ridge and stumbled down the other side, her momentum carrying her into a grove of ancient pines that offered nothing in the way of protection, but at least blocked her view of the pursuit. The bolter didn't slow. She heard it hit the ridge, heard the wet smack of its bulk against the stone, heard the tree trunks snapping like matchsticks as it plowed through the forest after her. She ran faster, pushing through branches that raked her face and arms, ignoring the pain, the blood, everything but the need to escape. She broke from the trees onto a slope of loose scree, her feet sliding and scrambling for purchase as she descended toward a valley she didn't recognize. The bolter emerged behind her, its new body glistening in the sunlight, its maw open and dripping fresh slime that sizzled when it hit the stone. It was 20 feet behind her, then 10, then close enough that she could feel the heat of its breath on her back. And then she tripped. A root, a stone, her own exhausted feet, she never knew what caught her. She went down hard, her chin hitting the scree and splitting open, blood filling her mouth and her vision swimming. She tried to rise, tried to keep running, but her ankle had twisted, her body had given out, and she could only crawl, dragging herself across the stone with fingers that bled from the effort. The bolter loomed over her, its shadow blocking out the sun. She could see into its maw, could see the rows of crystalline teeth that had grown back, sharper than before, could see the darkness of its throat and the muscular contractions that awaited her. She could smell the rot and the sulfur, could feel the heat radiating from its exposed flesh. It paused. The creature hung there, suspended over her like a geological death sentence, and Myra had time to wonder why it didn't strike, why it let her lie there bleeding and broken when it could have consumed her in an instant. And then she remembered Vance's words, remembered the journal's observation about immobility, about how the creature hunted by movement. She stopped crawling. She let her body go limp, let herself collapse onto the stone, forced her breathing to slow, her heart to quiet. She was prey, yes, but prey that had given up, prey that was no longer interesting, no longer sport. The bolter's many eyes regarded her with something like disappointment, something like frustration, and she felt its attention waver, felt it considering whether to take her anyway despite the lack of sport. Then a sound echoed across the valley, a scream from somewhere to the west, and the bolter's attention snapped toward it. Another survivor, another victim, someone who was still running, still fighting, still providing entertainment. The creature turned away from Myra, sliding past her without striking, leaving her lying there among the scree with the stench of its passage thick in her nostrils. It hunted the others. She heard their screams as it caught them, one by one, heard the wet sounds of consumption and the grinding of teeth. She lay still, playing dead, barely breathing, and prayed that the creature wouldn't return, that it would be satisfied with the others, that she would be forgotten. Hours passed. The sun crossed the sky and began its descent toward the western peaks. Myra lay motionless, her body numb, her mind drifting in and out of consciousness. She heard the bolter moving in the distance, heard it feeding, heard it making satisfied sounds like a cat with a belly full of cream. Then, as the light began to fade and the stars emerged in the darkening sky, she heard something else. A voice, ragged and exhausted, calling her name. She risked opening her eyes, just a crack, and saw a figure picking its way across the slope toward her. Elias Vance, the old trapper, somehow still alive despite the failed counterattack, despite everything. He had a rifle, she saw, though what good it would do against the creature she couldn't imagine. More importantly, he had a pack, and from it he produced a flare gun, firing it into the sky in a burst of red light that illuminated the mountainside in bloody hues. "Move, girl," he whispered, helping her to her feet, "while it's distracted, while it's feeding on the last of them." They ran together, the old man and the broken woman, stumbling down the slope toward the valley below. Behind them the bolter screamed again, but it was a sound of satiation now, not hunger, a creature content with its feast. They didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept moving until their legs gave out and they collapsed in a drainage ditch miles from the killing ground. They lay there through the night, listening to the sounds of the mountains. The bolter moved in the distance, sliding from peak to peak, its new body gleaming in the moonlight. They could hear its passage, could feel the vibrations in the stone, but it didn't come for them. It had fed, and for now it was satisfied. Dawn found them alive somehow, impossibly. They made their way down the mountain together, supporting each other, two survivors of an encounter that should have killed them both. They didn't speak, didn't need to. They had seen the same things, survived the same horror, and words were inadequate to the experience. They reached the nearest town by noon, staggering into the sheriff's office like refugees from a war zone. The authorities took one look at them, at Myra's blood-caked face and twisted ankle, at Vance's hollow eyes and trembling hands, and called for medical assistance. But when they tried to get the story, tried to understand what had happened in the mountains, all they got was silence. Myra and Vance exchanged a look, and in that look passed an understanding. No one would believe them. No one could believe them. The official story would be another tragic accident, another rockslide, another case of hikers underestimating the dangers of the wilderness. The truth was too terrible, too impossible to be accepted by a world that demanded rational explanations. So they said nothing. Let them believe what they wanted. What mattered was that they were alive, that they had survived, that they had faced the bolter and walked away. But as Myra lay in the hospital bed that night, her body pumped full of painkillers and sedatives, she heard something that made her blood run cold. From somewhere in the distance, carried on the wind that whispered through the open window, came the sound of screaming. Not the scream of an animal, but the scream of a human, high and sustained, and full of the knowledge of impending death. The bolter was hunting again, and there were other valleys, other peaks, other places where the creature could feed. It wasn't contained, wasn't defeated, wasn't even inconvenienced by their desperate gambit. It was still out there, still hungry, still patient. Vance found her in the morning, standing by the window, staring out at the mountains that rose in the distance like broken teeth against the sky. He didn't need to ask what she had heard. He had heard it too. "There's never just one," he said softly, the words hanging in the air like a curse. Myra turned to look at him, her face pale but her eyes burning with a new resolve. "Then we keep fighting," she said. "We find others who believe, who have seen, who know. We build an army, and we hunt them down, every one of them, until the mountains are safe again." Vance smiled, a grim expression that didn't reach his eyes. "You're a fool, girl," he said, "but you're my kind of fool." They left that afternoon, against doctor's orders, against the sheriff's wishes, against common sense and reason and every law of self-preservation. They had a journal, a story, and a mission. The bolter was still out there, still feeding, still growing bolder. But now it had enemies who knew its weaknesses, who understood its nature, who were willing to do whatever it took to stop it. The mountains were hungry and they would feed again. But for the first time in centuries, the prey was fighting back. Winter came to the never-summer mountains with a vengeance that year, early snows burying the high country in white, closing the trails and sending the wildlife to their burrows and dens. The tourists went home, the rangers retreated to their stations, and the mountains slept under their blanket of ice and silence. But not all of the mountains slept. In a snowfield high above the tree line, where the air was thin and the wind carved the drifts into sculptures of frozen crystal, something stirred. The snow trembled, shifted, began to rise in a mound that grew and grew until it matched the dimensions of the bolter that had terrorized the region through the long autumn. Then the mound cracked, split open like an egg, and a new creature emerged. It was smaller than the adult, barely 50 feet from fluke to maw, but it was perfect in every detail. The stone-like hide, the hooks on the underside, the crystalline teeth that lined its gaping throat. It slid from its frozen cradle with a sound like grinding millstones, shaking the snow from its newborn body, and oriented toward the distant peaks where its parent hunted. The bolter was not a single creature. It was a species, a population, a race of living stone that had ruled these mountains since before humans walked the earth, and they were breeding. The young one slid down the slope, testing its muscles, learning to move. It found a mountain goat on a ledge below, an old female too slow to escape, and practiced its hunting skills. The kill was messy, inefficient, but effective. The goat disappeared into the juvenile's maw, its screams muffled by the stone, and the creature felt the first thrill of satiation. Above, the parent bolter slid along the ridgeline, watching, teaching. This was how it had always been, how it would always be. The old fed and the young learned, and the mountains continued their ancient cycle of hunger and consumption. The snowfield where the juvenile had been born was not the only one. Throughout the range, in valleys and hollows and high peaks where humans rarely ventured, other mounds trembled, other eggs cracked, other young emerged into the winter light. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. The bolter was not one monster. It was an army, a civilization, an ecosystem of stone and hunger that spanned the entire mountain range. And they were growing, multiplying, spreading. Come spring, when the snows melted and the hikers returned, they would find a changed world. The trails they had walked for generations would be death traps. The peaks they had climbed would be hunting grounds. The wilderness they had loved would become a slaughterhouse, and they would be the livestock. The camera panned across the snowfield, capturing the image of the juvenile bolter as it made its first kill, then zoomed out to show the parent sliding along the ridge above, then out further to reveal the other snowfields, the other mounds, the other creatures awakening throughout the range. The shot held for a long moment, the silence broken only by the wind and the distant sound of grinding stone. Then the screen went black. In the darkness, a single line of text appeared. The mountains remember, the mountains hunger, the mountains will feed. The credits rolled over the sound of stone grinding on stone, of teeth closing on flesh, of screams fading into silence. And somewhere in the darkness, something laughed with a sound like avalanches. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.